In the morning, my son texted me. Plans changed. You are not coming on the cruise. My wife wants only her family. The next day, I canceled the payments, sold the house right out from under them, and left town. When they came back, the locks were changed, and a private security team was waiting at the door. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their perfect little lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who severely underestimated your worth. I am William Caldwell, 70 years old, and a retired logistics magnate. For 40 years, I ran a global supply chain empire out of Seattle. I built my life from absolute nothing, working 70-hour weeks, navigating cutthroat boardrooms and outsmarting ruthless competitors. I provided everything for my family. I made sure my son Bradley never knew the sting of poverty. I paid for his private schools, his college tuition, and his lavish wedding to his wife Monica. I thought my sharpest instincts were reserved for my business. I never imagined I would need to use those very same instincts to protect myself against my own flesh and blood. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was standing in the center of the sprawling kitchen of my Bellevue estate. It is a stunning property valued at roughly $3.5 million. The morning sun was pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows, catching the brilliant gleam of the imported Italian marble countertops. I remember the exact day those slabs were installed. I paid a small fortune for that marble. I paid for the custom cherry wood cabinetry. I paid for the commercial-grade appliances, the heated floors, the crystal chandeliers. I paid for every single nail and brick in this house. And yet, for the past 3 years, I had generously allowed Bradley and Monica to live here rent-free. The arrangement was supposed to be a temporary measure, a simple favor from a loving father to help his 35-year-old son and his 33-year-old wife save up enough money to buy their own home. I took the guest suite downstairs, trying to be unobtrusive, trying to give them space. On the marble counter in front of me sat a thick, elegantly embossed envelope. Inside were the physical VIP boarding passes for a luxury Mediterranean cruise. It was a 14-day voyage. First-class airfare to Miami, the grand owner suite on the ship, premium dining packages, private excursions, the works. I had paid $60,000 out of my own pocket to orchestrate this entire trip. It was meant to be the ultimate celebration for my 70th birthday, a milestone I wanted to share with my family. I wanted to sit on a balcony overlooking the ocean with my son, and I especially wanted to spend quality time with my 7-year-old grandson, Leo. My phone buzzed on the counter. A single text message from Bradley illuminated the screen. I picked it up, expecting a quick question about our flight itinerary, or maybe a reminder about packing. Instead, the words on the screen hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The text read, "Dad, plans changed. You are not coming on the cruise. Monica wants only her family there. We are taking her parents instead. Sorry, but we need the space." I stared at the glowing screen. I read the words again, and then a third time. I did not scream. I did not throw my phone across the room or smash my coffee mug against the wall. When you spend decades of your life managing high-stakes corporate crises, you learn to keep your heart rate steady when disaster strikes. You learn to breathe through the shock. But the irony of the situation was absolutely suffocating. I was looking at the tickets I had paid for, the massive suite I had booked, and my son was casually uninviting me from my own birthday celebration. He was kicking me off my own trip to accommodate his in-laws, Richard and Pamela. Two entitled people who had never worked a hard day in their lives, who constantly rode the coattails of my generosity, and who actively encouraged Monica's worst, most materialistic behaviors. I stood there in the quiet kitchen, breathing in the scent of the fresh espresso I had just made, letting the bitter reality wash over me. My son, a grown man who still needed his father to subsidize his luxurious lifestyle, was tossing me aside like a piece of garbage, and he did it through a text message. A coward's method. He did not even have the spine to look me in the eye and say it to my face. I slowly set my coffee mug down on the counter. I tapped his name on the screen and hit the call button. I raised the phone to my ear. It rang once, twice, 3 times. I knew exactly what was happening on the other end. I knew Bradley was staring at his screen, completely terrified to answer. Finally, on the 5th ring, the line clicked open. But Bradley did not say hello. I heard the muffled rustling of fabric, the distinct sound of a door carefully clicking shut. He was hiding. "Dad," he whispered. His voice was barely audible, tight with nervous panic and guilt. "I told you I was going to call you later when I got to the office. You sent a text, Bradley," I said, my voice dangerously calm, devoid of any warmth. "A text telling me I am no longer welcome on the $60,000 birthday trip I paid for. I thought perhaps your phone had been stolen. Because surely the son I raised would not be stupid enough to send something so incredibly disrespectful while living rent-free under my roof. Keep your voice down." Bradley hissed into the receiver, his breath catching in his throat. He was clearly terrified that Monica might hear him talking to me. "Dad, please." Monica's mother has been dealing with a lot of severe anxiety lately. She needs a vacation. She needs her family around her to heal. Your presence just makes Pamela nervous. You know how she gets around you. I am just trying to keep the peace in my marriage. You have to understand. I will make it up to you. I will take you on a weekend fishing trip next month. Just let them have this cruise." I closed my eyes. The sheer audacity of his words was almost impressive. He wanted me to hand over a $60,000 luxury vacation to the very people who despised me, just so he did not have to argue with his wife. Before I could even formulate a response to that pathetic excuse, I heard a sharp, irritated voice piercing through the background on his end. It was Monica. "Bradley," she snapped, her tone dripping with utter entitlement and disdain. "Who are you talking to in the closet? If it is your father, just tell the old man the boat is too crowded for his coughing fits. If he makes a scene about the money, tell him we are doing him a huge favor. At his age, a 14-day international trip is a medical risk anyway. He should be thanking us." The line went dead quiet as Bradley scrambled to cover the microphone, but it was too late. The words hung in the air, echoing in my mind. I did not hang up immediately. I just stood there, gripping the edge of the Italian marble counter that I owned inside the $3.5 million house that I owned. The betrayal was no longer just a suspicion. It was a glaring, undeniable fact. They did not just want my money. They wanted to erase me completely. And in that precise moment, a cold, calculating switch flipped in my brain. If they wanted me to disappear, I was more than happy to oblige. But I was taking my empire with me. I lowered the phone from my ear. The silence in the kitchen felt different now. It was no longer the silence of a peaceful morning. It was the quiet before a devastating storm. I looked at the VIP boarding passes one last time. They thought I was a clueless, tired old man who would just roll over and accept their disrespect. They had severely miscalculated. The line was open. I heard my son breathing, caught between panic and the hesitation of a cornered boy. I let the silence stretch. In the corporate world, silence is an effective weapon. The first to speak loses. I waited, leaning against the cool edge of the imported marble counter I had paid, for looking out the massive kitchen window at the manicured lawns of my estate. Every blade of grass was maintained by a crew I funded. "Dad," Bradley finally stammered, his voice trembling. "I know this looks bad. I was going to call you. I just did not know how to say it without upsetting you." "You managed to type it out just fine," I replied. My tone was perfectly even. I did not raise my voice or show an ounce of fury. "A text message, Bradley. After I spent $60,000 to upgrade this trip for your wife and son. You uninvite me with a text. It is not an uninviting, Dad. Please listen to me for a second." He was backpedaling, frantically searching for the exact script Monica had drilled into his head. I pictured him pacing in their closet, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I am listening," I said softly. "It is Monica's mother." Bradley began dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. Pamela has been having a hard time lately. She has severe anxiety. Her doctor strictly said she needs a major distraction, a complete change of scenery, to get her mental health back on track. Monica is beside herself with worry. We thought a family trip would be exactly what Pamela needs to recover properly. I took a slow breath, strictly maintaining my composure. And my presence on this luxury ship prevents her recovery. You know how she gets, Bradley pleaded, truly desperate to convince me. She is intimidated by you. She feels like you are always silently judging her because of your immense financial success. Your presence makes her incredibly uncomfortable, and her nerves cannot take the massive stress of trying to impress you for 14 days straight on a boat. Monica just wants her mother to heal in total peace, surrounded only by her immediate family. The sheer manipulation of his words was absolutely staggering to process. He was actually trying to spin my deliberate exclusion as a dire medical necessity for a woman who spent her weekends sipping mimosas at the country club on my dime. He was asking me to gracefully step aside from my own 70th birthday celebration out of pure pity for Pamela. So to cure your mother-in-law's anxiety, you are taking the luxury suite I booked and paid for, I stated clearly. Dad, please just be the bigger man here, Bradley begged, leaning completely into the emotional blackmail. You have traveled the entire world. You always say family comes first above all else. Monica is my wife. Her mother desperately needs this. I strongly need you to be totally understanding and gracefully let them have this trip. I solemnly promise I will genuinely make it up to you. We will go to the cabin next month, just you and me. We will go fishing for a week, like the good old days. Just please, do not make a huge deal out of this and completely ruin Monica's mood right before we leave. I was about to ask him exactly how he arrogantly planned to pay for his mother-in-law's premium dining packages and heavily overpriced private excursions, when another voice cut sharply through the distant background. It was distinct, impatient, and practically dripping with venom. Bradley, Monica snapped. Her voice was unmistakable, echoing perfectly clearly despite Bradley's desperate attempt to forcefully cup the plastic phone receiver. Who are you talking to in the closet? If it is your father, just tell the old man the boat is way too crowded for his disgusting coughing fits. If he seriously makes a massive scene about the money, tell him we are doing him a huge favor. At his age, a 14-day international trip is a serious medical risk anyway. He should absolutely be thanking us right now for generously taking the cruise tickets off his shaking hands. The secure phone line went dead quiet as Bradley frantically covered the sensitive microphone. A heavy, violently suffocating silence filled my extremely spacious kitchen entirely. The beautiful illusion of my loving family shattered completely, breaking into jagged, fully irreparable pieces right there on the expensive floor. She did not just want my trip. She fiercely viewed me as a totally pathetic, incredibly sickly old burden. A walking automated teller machine rapidly pushing forcefully past its exact expiration date. And my son, the boy I had lovingly raised from fragile infancy, the man I had fiercely protected from absolutely every single financial hardship, was willingly standing right there silently, letting her easily speak about me exactly like rotting luggage. Dad! Bradley's cowardly voice eventually returned a remarkably frantic, breathlessly weak whisper. Did you clearly hear that? She is just extremely stressed out right now. She is terribly overwhelmed with packing all the heavy bags. She did not exactly mean it the awful way it sounded. I heard her perfectly, Bradley, I said. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to march down to the guest suite, kick the oak door open, and throw them out onto the street with nothing but the designer clothes on their ungrateful backs. But acting on raw, volatile emotion is fundamentally the absolute fastest possible way to easily lose a massive strategic war. If I foolishly exploded right now, they would quickly brace themselves for the severe fallout. They would expertly play the victimized martyrs to absolutely everyone we ever knew. I deeply needed them to quickly leave my large house feeling entirely victorious. I genuinely needed them to enthusiastically board that massive ship, foolishly believing I was completely defeated and neutralized entirely. I deliberately softened my voice carefully, injecting it with the absolute perfect exact amount of elderly, entirely weary resignation. "You are absolutely right, son," I said intentionally, letting a long, incredibly heavy sigh slip carefully through my dry lips. Bradley sounded genuinely shocked, completely unable to fully believe his incredibly massive luck. "I am honestly getting way too old for these incredibly long, exhausting international flights, anyway. You all quickly go. Fully enjoy the beautiful warm Mediterranean weather. I will comfortably stay right here and quietly rest my tired bones." I swiftly hung up the phone abruptly, entirely, before he could annoyingly offer another completely fake, nervously stammering apology. I calmly picked up the VIP boarding passes and walked slowly out of the kitchen, heading directly toward my private home office. I needed to file the cruise documents safely and promptly retrieve the vital corporate contact files. I confidently walked right into the dark, heavily wood-paneled room. I purposefully approached the heavy mahogany filing cabinet, resting securely in the far corner. I reached deeply into my pocket for the small, familiar brass key, but as my right hand gently brushed the handle, my fingers felt sharp, metallic shavings. The heavy, thick brass lock had been brutally drilled cleanly out. I stood perfectly still in the dim light of my home office, my fingertips coated in the fine metallic dust of a destroyed lock. I breathed in the distinct metallic scent lingering in the quiet air. The heavy mahogany filing cabinet, a custom piece I had commissioned 30 years ago, stood violated. This was not a delicate job. Someone had taken a power drill directly to the solid brass cylinder, boring straight through the intricate tumblers until the locking mechanism completely collapsed. The raw wood around the metal casing was splintered and scarred. I wiped the brass shavings from my hand using a handkerchief from my pocket, forcing my breathing to remain slow and measured. When you discover a breach in your perimeter, panic is your absolute worst enemy. You do not react, you assess. I looked around the room. The expensive artwork was still hanging perfectly straight on the walls. The vintage silver clock sat undisturbed on the mantel. My computer monitors were exactly where I had left them. A common thief tears through a room looking for easily pawned electronics and visible valuables. A common thief leaves a trail of chaotic destruction. This room was entirely too pristine. The only thing disturbed was the one cabinet where I kept the foundational documents of my entire existence. I grabbed the polished brass handle and pulled the top drawer open. It glided silently on its steel tracks, revealing the organized interior. My eyes instantly darted to the back right corner, the spot where I kept the velvet jewelry box belonging to my late wife, Caroline. I reached out and gently opened the lid. The diamond earrings, the pearl necklace, and her platinum engagement ring rested exactly as they always had, shimmering quietly in the low light. Next to the velvet box was a thick, unsealed manila envelope containing $10,000 in crisp sequential $100 bills. It was my standard emergency cash reserve, something I always kept on hand for unexpected contingencies. I picked up the envelope and flipped through the stack. Not a single bill was missing. I placed the money back into its designated spot and closed the jewelry box. The sheer magnitude of this realization sent a profound chill radiating down my spine. Whoever had taken a loud, heavy power drill to my secure filing cabinet had absolutely no interest whatsoever in untraceable cash or highly valuable diamonds. They were searching for something vastly more lucrative than loose jewelry. They were searching for control. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Bradley and Monica lived in this house. They had unrestricted access to this floor. They knew my schedule intimately. They knew exactly when I took my morning walks around the estate grounds. I shifted my attention to the hanging file folders suspended in the center of the deep drawer. I am a meticulous man. I have spent my entire career managing complex global logistics, and that rigorous discipline extends directly into my personal record keeping. The violation of my privacy was absolutely deliberate and incredibly methodical. Every single folder is always perfectly aligned, alphabetically categorized, and neatly tabbed. But now the files were a chaotic mess. Folders were shoved back indiscriminately. Papers were jutting out at odd angles, crinkled and out of order. I began pulling the compromised folders out one by one, laying them flat on my desk to analyze exactly what had been scrutinized. The first folder contained the original property deeds for the Bellevue estate. The documents were severely disorganized, completely pulled out of their protective plastic sleeves. The second disturbed folder held my comprehensive medical records. Every physical exam, every routine blood test, every medical note from the past decade had been thoroughly rifled through. I stared at the two categories of documents resting side by side on my desk: real estate ownership and medical history. The juxtaposition was entirely too specific to be a random coincidence. They were not looking for my stock portfolios. They were not checking my liquid bank balances. They were looking exclusively at my physical assets and my physical health. My mind began working with cold, relentless precision, connecting the seemingly disparate pieces of information into one horrifying, cohesive narrative. I thought about the luxury Mediterranean cruise. I had booked a 14-day voyage. 14 days completely isolated on a ship, effectively disconnected from my local contacts, my business associates, and my trusted legal counsel. They needed my undeniable physical absence to perfectly facilitate their initial scheme. The cruise was never meant to be a joyful family celebration. It was a highly coordinated, deliberately planned distraction. It was a massive logistical maneuver designed specifically to get me out of the country for 2 solid weeks. They needed me thousands of miles away, floating in the middle of the ocean, where I could not easily intervene in whatever domestic agenda they were executing. But then the plan abruptly changed. Bradley had sent that cowardly text message this morning, suddenly forcing me to stay behind. Monica had loudly complained about my presence in the background of the phone call. Why the sudden pivot? If their original master plan required me to be totally absent for 14 days, why actively maneuver to keep me trapped inside this house today? The answer crystallized in my mind with terrifying clarity. Their timeline had shifted. Something in their scheme required my immediate, undeniable physical presence in the city, or perhaps my explicit failure to appear at a specific designated location. They did not just want me off the boat. They actively needed me to be a solitary, isolated old man, sitting alone in his sprawling house, completely unaware of the trap closing tightly around him. I needed more information. I plunged my hands back into the drawer, digging furiously past the medical files and the property deeds. I reached the very back of the cabinet, pulling out a thick stack of old archived tax returns from 5 years ago. As I lifted the heavy bundle of outdated tax forms, a small crumpled piece of paper fluttered down and landed softly on the bottom of the wooden drawer. It looked entirely out of place, a piece of modern refuse discarded among decades of pristine corporate records. I reached down and picked it up. It was a standard carbon copy receipt, the kind printed by a portable card reader. The edges were partially torn, as if someone had hastily attempted to shred it by hand before giving up and simply shoving it into the deepest corner of the open cabinet. I smoothed the wrinkled paper flat against the surface of my desk and leaned in close to read the faded purple ink. I felt cold rage build. The shocking betrayal was now sitting right in the palm of my hand. The document was dated exactly 3 days ago. It was an official receipt issued by a certified notary public. My eyes tracked slowly down the printed text to the line detailing the specific service rendered. The ink spelled out the requested service in completely unmistakable letters. The receipt was for the notarization of a document titled Power of Attorney and Equity Release. I folded the torn receipt and placed it carefully into the inner breast pocket of my jacket. The air in my home office suddenly felt incredibly stagnant, heavy with the suffocating weight of sheer deceit. I did not confront Bradley or Monica. I walked out of the room, closed the heavy door behind me, and proceeded down the main hallway toward the garage. My footsteps were completely silent on the hardwood floors. As I passed the living room, I could hear Bradley and Monica arguing upstairs about packing luggage for the cruise. Their voices were muffled, wrapped in the blissful ignorance of criminals who firmly believed their victim was entirely subdued. I stepped into the cool garage and approached my car. My mind shifted gears, dropping the emotional mantle of a betrayed father and adopting the cold, pragmatic perspective of a corporate executive facing a hostile takeover. I backed my car out of the driveway and deliberately navigated the winding, heavily tree-lined streets of my quiet, affluent suburban neighborhood, keeping my eyes fixed forward. I had purchased the Bellevue estate in cash precisely 10 years ago, completely liquidating my final mortgage balance on the very day I officially retired from the logistics firm. It was my sanctuary, a tangible monument to 40 years of relentless labor. The idea that someone had quietly attached a financial anchor to my property without my explicit consent was physically nauseating. I smoothly pulled into the expansive parking lot of my primary financial institution, safely parked my luxury vehicle, and confidently walked right through the automatic sliding glass doors with deliberate, heavily measured strides. I bypassed the standard teller line completely and walked directly toward the glass-paneled office of the regional branch manager, a man named Richard Thompson. Richard and I had carefully maintained a highly lucrative, remarkably consistent professional banking relationship for well over a decade, meeting annually to review my accounts. He immediately stood up from his leather chair when he saw me approach, offering a wide, perfectly rehearsed corporate smile. I took a seat across from his polished desk. I told him I needed to conduct a comprehensive review of my primary accounts, specifically concerning any recent activities tied directly to my residential property. Richard chuckled warmly, completely misreading the severe tension radiating from my posture. He leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers, looking at me with genuine professional admiration. He told me he was actually quite surprised to see me authorizing such a massive transaction, given my historically conservative approach to debt management during my retirement years. He cheerfully congratulated me on successfully securing the $800,000 home equity line of credit. He added that the massive wire transfer had cleared the international banking protocols just yesterday afternoon. The words hung in the sterile, air-conditioned air of the office. $800,000. My chest tightened painfully, but my face remained an unreadable mask of absolute calm. I asked him to pull up the exact documentation for this approved credit line, casually mentioning that I wanted to verify the final routing numbers for my personal records. Richard nodded eagerly and began typing on his keyboard. He slowly turned his large computer monitor directly toward me, proudly displaying the sharply digitized copies of the finalized, legally binding loan agreements on the bright screen. I stared blankly at the bright screen, forcefully commanding my aging eyes to carefully process the deeply disturbing financial information line by agonizing, terrible line. There was my name, William Caldwell, listed as the primary borrower. Below it was a digital rendering of my personal signature. It was an incredibly sophisticated forgery. The loop of the letter W and the sharp slant of the letter C were meticulously replicated, but it lacked the natural fluid pressure of my actual handwriting. Someone had clearly spent countless hours practicing my exact penmanship until they could reproduce it well enough to fool a standard banking clerk. But a signature alone could not authorize a transaction of this magnitude. The bank required verified in-person authorization. That was where the power of attorney document came into play. I scrolled down the screen, reviewing the attached legal files. There was a comprehensive, legally binding power of attorney assigning sweeping financial control to my son Bradley. The document claimed I was voluntarily relinquishing temporary control of my assets due to impending medical treatments. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was staggering. They had waited until I was fast asleep in my own bed, practicing my signature in the dead of night, quietly preparing the administrative chains that would effectively bind my entire estate. I asked Richard to show me the final destination of the dispersed funds. He clicked another tab, pulling up the international wire transfer receipt. The $800,000 had not gone into a joint family account or a domestic investment portfolio. The entire sum had been wired directly to an offshore cryptocurrency exchange platform headquartered in the Cayman Islands. I looked closely at the designated beneficiary listed on the receiving account. It was registered under a private corporate entity, but the primary managing director was clearly listed as Monica Caldwell. My daughter-in-law had leveraged the entire value of my paid-off home to quietly fund a highly volatile, completely untraceable offshore crypto venture. I felt a cold, bitter taste rising in the back of my throat. I asked Richard how this incredibly complex package of legal documents had been officially verified. He proudly explained that Bradley had brought the fully executed paperwork into the branch personally, accompanied by a state-licensed notary public who provided the required legal authentication. Richard stated that the notary had presented all the necessary state credentials, stamped the documents, and provided a sworn declaration that I had signed the papers in his direct presence. I kept my voice perfectly level and requested to see the digital copy of the identification card this notary had provided to the bank for their mandatory security records. Richard smiled, clicked his mouse a few times, and opened the final scanned document in the digital file. He smoothly turned the flat screen slightly more toward my direction, allowing me to fully inspect the uploaded image. The high-resolution scan displayed a standard state driver license. I stared at the color photograph of the young man staring back at me from the screen. He had a smug, arrogant expression, messy dark hair, and a highly recognizable facial structure. I felt the last remaining shreds of my familial compassion evaporate entirely. The notary public, who had sworn under penalty of perjury that he had personally witnessed my signature, was not an independent, objective legal professional. The man smiling arrogantly from the scanned identification card was Monica's younger brother. He was an unemployed, chronically unreliable young man who had been struggling with severe gambling debts for the past 5 years. They had not just cowardly stolen my hard-earned money in the shadows. They had deliberately kept the entire treacherous criminal conspiracy completely hidden inside the deeply toxic ranks of her own immediate family. This specific realization solidified my resolve to completely destroy them. I left the bank without saying another word to Richard. The polished glass doors slid shut behind me, completely sealing off the sterile financial environment, but the cold reality of the situation followed me out into the crisp Seattle air. I did not go to the police. Law enforcement is slow-bound by bureaucratic red tape and endless procedural delays. A police investigation into intra-family financial disputes can easily drag on for months, effectively leaving my assets frozen and my life in limbo. I needed immediate surgical precision. I needed a professional predator. I climbed into my car and drove directly to the towering downtown skyscraper that housed the law offices of Thomas Mitchell. Thomas was not a family lawyer. He was a ruthless corporate litigator who had successfully defended my supply chain empire against hostile takeovers and aggressive union disputes for over 20 years. He was a man who viewed the law not as an instrument of blind justice, but as a heavily fortified battlefield. When I walked into his expansive corner office overlooking the gray waters of Puget Sound, he immediately recognized the severity of my posture. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I sat down in the leather chair opposite his massive glass desk and laid out exactly what I had discovered at the bank. I explained the $800,000 home equity line of credit, the offshore cryptocurrency transfer, the forged signature, and the fraudulent notary public stamp provided by Monica's gambling-addicted brother. Thomas listened in absolute silence. His face was a mask of intense concentration. He did not express shock or offer useless sympathies. Instead, he simply nodded, turned to his computer, and began accessing his secure legal databases. His fingers flew across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. He bypassed the standard banking portals and dove directly into the state registry and the King County civil court systems. For 10 agonizing minutes, the only sound in the cavernous office was the rapid clicking of his keyboard and the low hum of the central air conditioning. I watched his eyes dart across the glowing screens, searching for the digital footprints Bradley and Monica had left behind in their arrogant haste. Suddenly, Thomas stopped typing. He leaned closer to the monitor, his brow furrowing into a deep, troubling scowl. He clicked his mouse once, opening a new window, and then slowly turned his head to look at me. The purely professional detachment had momentarily vanished from his eyes, replaced by a look of genuine, profound concern. He told me that the financial theft, while significant, was not the most dangerous maneuver they had executed. He explained that the home equity line of credit was merely the funding mechanism for a much larger, far more sinister legal strategy. He pressed a button on his desk phone, ordering his paralegal to immediately print the document he had just located in the county court database. A minute later, the heavy wooden door opened, and his assistant walked in, handing Thomas a thick stack of freshly printed papers. Thomas dismissed her with a wave of his hand. He took the warm papers, aligned the edges perfectly, and slowly slid the heavy stack across the smooth glass desk toward me. I reached out and picked up the top sheet. The thick black letters of the legal header seemed to burn themselves directly into my retinas. It was an official date stamped filing from the King County Superior Court. The document was titled, Petition for Emergency Medical Guardianship and Full Conservatorship. I stared at the words, feeling a sudden icy void open in the pit of my stomach. Thomas leaned forward, clasping his hands together tightly. He explained the horrifying details outlined in the extensive legal brief. Bradley and Monica had officially petitioned the court to declare me mentally incompetent. The filing falsely claimed that I was suffering from severe, rapidly advancing, late-stage dementia. They had meticulously fabricated a narrative stating that I was completely unable to manage my own vast financial affairs, that I was a danger to my own physical well-being, and that I required immediate permanent legal supervision. I flipped frantically through the pages, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. They had attached sworn affidavits from Monica claiming she had witnessed me wandering the neighborhood aimlessly. They had included a forged medical evaluation, a fake psychological assessment, conveniently diagnosing me with severe cognitive decline. That explained the violated filing cabinet in my home office. They had rifled through my legitimate medical files to steal the official letterhead and signature block of my primary care physician, meticulously constructing a fraudulent medical narrative that aligned perfectly with their vicious lies. They had used my own private health records to build the psychological prison they intended to lock me inside forever. The sheer scale of their cruelty was almost impossible to process. They did not just want to steal my hard-earned money. They wanted to strip away my fundamental human rights. They wanted to reduce me to a helpless ward of the state, entirely dependent on their false charity. I looked up at Thomas, my voice low and dangerous. I asked him how they possibly expected to win a guardianship hearing when a judge would clearly see that I am perfectly lucid, highly articulate, and entirely capable of defending myself in a court of law. Thomas shook his head grimly. He pointed a steady finger at the final page of the petition, directing my attention to a small, brightly highlighted box containing the official court scheduling information. He explained that in emergency guardianship petitions, the court moves with incredible speed to protect the allegedly vulnerable senior citizen. A mandatory evaluation hearing had already been scheduled by the presiding judge. I looked closely under the printed date. The hearing was officially set for exactly 12 days from today. The final devastating piece of the puzzle violently clicked into place, illuminating the absolute darkness of their master plan. The luxury Mediterranean cruise they had booked for me was scheduled to last exactly 14 days. They had orchestrated the entire lavish vacation exclusively to ensure I would be floating somewhere off the coast of Italy when the formal court summons arrived at my empty house. They knew with absolute certainty that I would never see the legal notification. They knew I would never show up to defend myself in front of the judge, Thomas leaned back in his leather chair, his voice dropping into a somber, urgent tone. He outlined the terrifying reality of the ticking clock. If I failed to appear in that specific courtroom in 12 days, the judge would immediately rule in favor of the petitioners. A default judgment would be swiftly entered into the permanent legal record. By the time the 14-day cruise concluded, and I happily returned to Seattle, the trap would have already snapped completely shut. I would step off the airplane to discover that I no longer owned my home. I no longer controlled my corporate assets, and I no longer possessed the basic legal right to make decisions about my own life. Monica would be my court-appointed guardian. She would possess total, unchecked legal authority to liquidate my entire estate, drain my massive retirement accounts, and forcibly place me into a locked, heavily medicated memory care facility against my will. She would have the ultimate power to isolate me from the outside world, completely silencing me forever, while she and Bradley comfortably spent the fortune I had spent 40 years building from nothing. The silence in the office was deafening. The stakes had instantly elevated from simple financial theft to a desperate fight for my basic freedom and personal survival. They had meticulously built a flawless, inescapable legal cage, perfectly timing the lock to snap shut, while I was blissfully distracted on a luxury vacation. They had accounted for absolutely everything in their complex criminal equation. They had anticipated every single variable except one. They had stupidly decided to change the plan at the very last minute to accommodate Monica's entitled mother. By sending that arrogant text message and uninviting me from the cruise, they had accidentally left me standing right inside the cage with my eyes wide open. The cruise was meant to be my final distraction, but instead it had become their fatal mistake. I looked across the desk at Thomas, feeling a cold, unstoppable surge of pure adrenaline replacing the shock. I tapped my finger firmly on the fraudulent medical petition. I told my lawyer that we were not just going to defend against this pathetic attack. We were going to utterly annihilate them. The morning of their departure was crisp and clear, a perfect backdrop for the greatest performance of my life. I dressed with calculated care. I selected an oversized beige cardigan and trousers that sat too high on my waist. I needed to look like a man whose mind was slipping into the fog of dementia. I drove to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. I slowly walked into the bustling departure terminal with a slow, uneven gait, letting my shoulders slump forward to project complete physical fragility. I found them easily. They were clustered near the premium check-in counter, a mountain of designer luggage piled around them. Bradley was arguing with a skycap, while Monica furiously typed on her phone. Standing slightly apart from them, already sipping expensive iced coffees, were her parents, Richard and Pamela. They looked completely unaware of their impending ruin. I approached the group, slowly dragging my feet just enough to make my arrival noticeable but pitiful. Bradley saw me first. His eyes widened in absolute panic, his face draining of color. He likely feared I had successfully discovered the fraudulent home equity line of credit he had secretly secured against my estate. I immediately disarmed his terror with a wide, vacuous smile. I reached out with trembling hands and grasped his forearms, acting completely oblivious to his severe discomfort. I warmly told him I could not let my only son leave for such a long journey without a proper goodbye. The relief that washed over his face was absolutely sickening to witness. He exhaled a long, shaky breath and awkwardly patted my shoulder, slipping right back into his role of the benevolent, deeply burdened son. I then turned my attention to the in-laws. I looked at Richard and Pamela with a blank, pleasantly confused expression. I reached out to shake Richard's hand purposely, letting my grip remain weak. I looked him dead in the eye and warmly called him Robert. I asked him how his golf swing was holding up, a sport I knew for a fact he absolutely hated and never played. Richard awkwardly corrected me, casting a highly significant, deeply knowing glance toward his wife. Pamela offered me a tight, painfully condescending smile, the kind of smile one reserves for a confused toddler. I then turned to Pamela and completely blanked on her name, calling her Patricia, and asking if she had remembered to pack her arthritis medication. The sheer level of smug satisfaction radiating from the four adults was palpable. I was giving them exactly what they needed to justify their impending legal theft. I was validating every single fraudulent medical document they had filed with the county court. Then I looked down and saw my grandson Leo. He was sitting on a small suitcase, swinging his legs, looking bored and tired. The sight of him struck a genuine, agonizing chord deep within my chest. He was the only completely innocent variable in this entire disgusting equation. I knelt down slowly, letting my joints crack audibly to maintain the illusion, and pulled him into a tight embrace. He hugged me back fiercely, his small arms wrapping around my neck. He asked me why I was not coming on the big boat with them. He said he wanted me to show him how to spot the dolphins. I swallowed the thick lump forming in my throat. I told him that Grandpa was just feeling a little too tired for the big waves, but that I would be waiting right here for him when he got back. I promised him that we would have our own special adventure very soon. I kissed the top of his head and stood back up, forcing my face back into that mild, vacant expression. Monica stepped forward, then practically vibrating with triumphant arrogance. She was wearing a massive diamond tennis bracelet, undoubtedly purchased with the stolen equity from my house. She placed a hand on my arm, her touch feeling like absolute ice. She told me in a sickly sweet, incredibly loud voice that I needed to make sure I locked all the doors and remembered to take my daily vitamins. I nodded obediently, looking down at my shoes. As I turned slightly to step back, Monica leaned into her mother. She did not bother to lower her voice enough. She was so entirely confident in my supposed cognitive decline that she felt completely invincible. I heard her whisper directly into Pamela's ear. She said, "Just look at him. The frail old fool will not even remember we are gone by tomorrow morning." I stood in the center of the chaotic terminal and watched them gather their massive pile of stolen luxury. They handed their premium boarding passes to the attendant and moved toward the priority security checkpoint. Bradley did not look back. Monica did not look back. Only little Leo turned around, waving his small hand at me, before disappearing behind the frosted glass partition. I maintained my slumped, pathetic posture for exactly 3 more minutes, ensuring they were completely out of sight and thoroughly processed through the security lines. Then the performance officially ended. I straightened my spine. I rolled my shoulders back, letting the fake frailty vanish instantly. The confused, harmless old man evaporated into the sterile airport air, replaced entirely by the ruthless corporate architect who had spent 4 decades dismantling business competitors. I turned on my heel and walked with absolute purpose toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows directly overlooking the busy airport tarmac. I watched the sleek commercial jets lining up for departure, knowing that my son and his toxic wife were sitting in first class sipping complimentary champagne, confidently toasting to their brilliant, flawless criminal success. They honestly believed they had successfully secured a massive, completely untraceable fortune without any severe consequences. They believed they had permanently discarded a helpless burden. They believed they had decisively won the absolute ultimate prize. I reached into the inner pocket of my cardigan and pulled out my smartphone. I opened my secure contacts and pressed the direct dial button for the elite client services division of my primary credit card provider. The card currently holding the $20,000 security deposit for their Grand Mediterranean suite. A representative answered immediately, greeting me with utmost professional deference. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the icy, lethal precision of a man executing a flawless corporate strike. I told the representative that I needed to report a highly suspicious, potentially fraudulent charge. I clearly instructed them to immediately and permanently cancel the primary platinum credit card currently linked directly to the Royal Caribbean VIP account. I told them to completely lock down the entire connected financial profile to prevent any further catastrophic monetary breaches. The professional representative politely asked if I wanted them to completely halt the ship's boarding process right now. I smiled, watching their massive plane push back from the busy terminal gate. I calmly shook my head and simply said, absolutely not. Let them eagerly board the massive ship. Let them sail far out into completely isolated, utterly unforgiving international waters, then swiftly and mercilessly cut their financial oxygen off. I lowered my phone from my ear and watched the silver fuselage of the massive commercial jet completely disappear into the dense gray clouds gathering over the Seattle skyline. The absolute finality of the moment washed over me, leaving behind a sharp, deeply clarifying sense of pure focus. They were gone. For the next 14 days, they were entirely physically contained, floating blissfully unaware toward their absolute financial ruin. I turned away from the sprawling terminal window and walked back through the crowded airport concourse. I did not feel the heavy, suffocating weight of betrayal anymore. I only felt the cold, mechanical rhythm of a meticulously planned corporate execution taking shape. I retrieved my car from the short-term parking garage and navigated the busy interstate highway back toward the quiet, affluent suburbs. The drive felt remarkably brief. When I pulled through the towering wrought iron gates of the Bellevue estate, the sprawling property was completely silent. I parked the car and walked slowly through the massive front doors. The grand foyer, usually echoing with Monica's constant demanding voice and Bradley's pathetic appeasing murmurs, was now perfectly still. I walked through the immaculate living spaces, my footsteps echoing against the imported marble floors. They had left their personal belongings scattered everywhere, a testament to their arrogant comfort. Expensive designer coats were draped casually over the custom velvet sofas. Half-empty bottles of premium imported water sat carelessly on the polished mahogany coffee tables. They had treated my sanctuary like an extended-stay luxury hotel, completely confident that it would permanently belong to them, the very moment a corrupted judge signed their fraudulent medical guardianship petition. I walked directly into my violated home office. I bypassed the ruined filing cabinet entirely and sat down behind my heavy desk. I opened my personal laptop and initiated a secure, encrypted video conference call with my corporate attorney, Thomas Mitchell. His face appeared on the bright screen almost instantly. His expression was serious, fully prepared for the aggressive tactical offensive we had briefly outlined earlier. I told Thomas that the primary targets were successfully airborne and completely out of local jurisdiction for the next 2 weeks. I instructed him to immediately execute the property asset liquidation protocol we had discussed. Thomas nodded sharply, his fingers already flying rapidly across his secondary keyboard. The strategic maneuver was entirely brutal in its absolute efficiency. I instructed Thomas to immediately transfer the original unencumbered deed of the Bellevue estate directly into a newly formed, completely anonymous, limited liability company. Because I was still the sole legally recognized owner of the property, and because the fraudulent guardianship hearing was not scheduled to occur for another 12 days, I retained full absolute legal authority to aggressively move my own physical assets. The $800,000 home equity line of credit they had secretly taken out against the property was a severe complication. However, that fraudulent debt would naturally have to be settled during any formal property transfer, but I simply did not care about the immediate financial penalty. I was entirely willing to absorb the temporary monetary loss to execute a flawless, totally devastating tactical strike. I wanted to completely eradicate the physical foundation of their arrogant assumptions. Thomas smoothly finalized the rapid corporate transfer, officially placing the multi-million-dollar estate into the hidden digital vault of the newly minted corporate entity. Then we moved to the second, far more vindictive phase of the operation. I did not simply want to sell the house through a traditional real estate broker. A standard public listing would take months, allowing Bradley and Monica the opportunity to return from their cruise, discover the sale, and immediately file massive legal injunctions to halt the complex process. I needed the house completely liquidated, aggressively emptied, and formally transferred to a fiercely hostile third party. I needed this done before their ship ever returned to its home port. I told Thomas to immediately contact a highly specialized, remarkably aggressive corporate entity known as Apex Property Solutions. Apex was not a standard family-friendly real estate brokerage. They were a notoriously ruthless property management firm that specialized almost exclusively in high-speed, heavily discounted corporate liquidations and immediate, uncompromising residential evictions. They specifically targeted highly distressed properties, purchasing them entirely in cash, gutting the interiors, and rapidly flipping the raw assets for massive corporate profit. They were famous for their absolute lack of empathy and their terrifyingly efficient legal aggression. Thomas negotiated the unprecedented corporate sale directly with the primary managing directors of Apex Property Solutions over the course of the next 3 hours. Because we completely bypassed standard residential inspections, totally ignored prolonged closing periods, and offered the massive property at a substantially discounted cash rate, the firm eagerly agreed. We securely locked in a $3 million all-cash corporate buyout. The legally binding contract explicitly stipulated a heavily accelerated, totally uncompromising 5-day closing period. I was officially selling the anonymous company, and by direct extension, the entire physical Bellevue estate, completely out from under my treacherous family. The next 5 days passed in a blur of quiet, deeply methodical preparation. I moved through the sprawling house like a ghost, systematically gathering only my most cherished, irreplaceable personal belongings. I carefully packed Caroline's velvet jewelry box, the thick envelope containing the untraceable cash, my original corporate founding documents, and a few small, deeply sentimental photographs. I deliberately left absolutely everything else exactly where it was. I left Monica's expensive designer wardrobe hanging perfectly in the massive master closet. I left Bradley's custom golf clubs resting neatly in the pristine garage. I left all of their stolen luxury goods entirely abandoned to their impending, terrifying fate. I secured a quiet, highly exclusive long-term suite at a premium downtown hotel, physically removing myself from the blast radius of the impending corporate explosion. On the morning of the 5th day, the massive cash transfer successfully cleared the international banking protocols. $3 million officially landed securely inside my newly established, heavily encrypted corporate accounts. The Bellevue estate was no longer my property. It now legally belonged exclusively to Apex Property Solutions. I stood quietly on the sidewalk across the street from the towering wrought iron gates, holding a small travel bag, waiting in the cool morning air. I did not have to wait very long. Exactly at 9 o'clock, a loud, heavy rumbling sound echoed down the quiet suburban street. A massive fleet of large, unmarked industrial moving trucks slowly turned the corner, their heavy diesel engines growling aggressively. Leading the imposing convoy was a sleek black luxury vehicle. They blocked the pristine driveway. 3 men wearing immaculate business suits stepped confidently out. They were the liquidation executives from Apex Property Solutions. They were immediately followed by a large, intimidating private security team wearing dark tactical uniforms and carrying heavy metal clipboards. The security personnel quickly moved to physically secure the perimeter of the sprawling property. They marched directly toward the front doors with absolute legal authority, backed by a finalized corporate deed to forcefully take immediate possession. The massive house was about to be ruthlessly gutted by the aggressive corporate demolition team. It was day 4 of the luxury Mediterranean cruise. I sat comfortably in the deep leather armchair of my penthouse suite at the downtown Seattle luxury hotel. The heavy rain pattered gently against the floor-to-ceiling windows, blurring the bright city lights into a wash of muted colors. I held a crystal glass of 18-year-old single malt scotch, feeling the smooth warmth of the amber liquid slide down my throat. The past 96 hours had been an absolute masterpiece of corporate demolition. The aggressive executives from Apex Property Solutions had not wasted a single minute. They had descended upon the Bellevue estate like a swarm of ravenous locusts. My former neighbors' people, who had politely waved to Bradley and Monica for years, had stood on their manicured lawns in sheer shock as the massive industrial moving trucks systematically emptied the entire property. Every piece of custom furniture, every designer handbag, every expensive golf club had been unceremoniously hauled out and tossed into temporary storage containers, their contents completely frozen, pending the massive legal disputes that were surely about to follow. The house itself was already being actively gutted, the pristine hardwood floors ripped up to make way for a rapid corporate flip. The physical anchor of their entire fraudulent scheme had been entirely wiped off the map, completely successfully erasing every single trace of their deeply miserable existence forever. I took another slow sip of my scotch, savoring the absolute silence of my secure suite. Then the silence was violently shattered. My smartphone resting on the polished glass coffee table in front of me lit up brightly. The screen displayed an incoming international call. The country code indicated it was originating directly from Italy. I did not move to pick it up. I simply sat back and watched the digital screen glow in the dim light of the room. The phone rang until it automatically diverted to voicemail. A minute later, it rang again, then a third time, then a fourth. The sheer desperation radiating from the glowing screen was a highly intoxicating spectacle to silently witness. They were officially thousands of miles away, floating somewhere in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, and the heavy steel doors of reality were finally slamming shut entirely around them. I let the phone ring 7 consecutive times before the digital display finally went completely dark. A small red notification icon appeared indicating a series of frantic voicemails had been left. I placed my crystal glass carefully on the coaster, picked up the phone, and tapped the screen to play the first audio message. I pressed the speaker button, allowing the sound to fill the quiet room. Bradley's voice burst from the small speaker, completely stripped of its usual arrogant confidence. He sounded breathless, panicked, and entirely out of his depth. He stammered frantically, begging me to pick up the phone immediately. He explained that there was a massive problem on the ship. The luxury cruise line had attempted to process the mandatory $20,000 security hold for their premium penthouse suite, and the primary platinum credit card had been aggressively declined. He said the ship's financial concierge had discreetly escorted them down to the administrative deck to resolve the issue, assuming it was a simple international banking error. But when Bradley had attempted to use his secondary cards, every single one of them had bounced immediately. They were completely locked out of their accounts. He pleaded with me, his voice pitching higher with every word, asking me to call my banking representative to authorize the massive charge so they could access their room. He swore it was just a temporary banking freeze. As he rambled his pathetic excuses, a second voice pierced through the background audio. It was Monica, and she was absolutely hysterical. She was screaming at the top of her lungs, her shrill voice echoing off the metallic bulkheads of the cruise ship. She demanded that Bradley stop leaving pathetic voicemails and call the bank directly. She shrieked that her parents were currently standing in the ship's grand lobby, surrounded by their massive pile of designer luggage, being actively stared at by the other wealthy passengers. She practically sobbed as she yelled that the ship's security team had officially deactivated their premium room keys and was threatening to forcefully disembark them at the next port of call if the massive financial deficit was not immediately resolved. She screamed that their entire vacation was completely ruined and that they were being publicly humiliated in front of her deeply snobbish mother. She aggressively demanded he fix the humiliating disaster right this very second. I listened to the spectacular audio of their complete marital breakdown, an absolute symphony of pure, unadulterated panic. They were stranded in a foreign country, utterly stripped of their stolen financial armor, totally exposed to the harsh reality of their own sheer incompetence. The fake aristocratic world they had so meticulously built upon a foundation of my stolen labor was violently crashing down entirely around them. I took another sip of my scotch, letting the rich, smoky flavor wash over my tongue. I felt absolutely no pity whatsoever. I felt no parental guilt. They had happily signed a fraudulent document aiming to lock me in a permanent psychological prison, assuming I would simply fade away into quiet oblivion. They had wildly underestimated their target. The financial freeze was merely the opening salvo in a much broader, completely inescapable legal war. While they were desperately arguing with a ship concierge over a declined credit card, my legal team was actively dismantling their entire fraudulent existence back home. The home equity line of credit had been officially flagged as thoroughly fraudulent. Their offshore cryptocurrency accounts were currently being aggressively targeted by federal investigators for massive wire fraud. The power of attorney had been forcefully revoked and flagged for severe criminal forgery. They had absolutely nothing left to leverage. The luxurious life they thought they had permanently stolen had completely evaporated entirely into thin air. I picked up my phone and opened my text message application. I navigated to Bradley's contact profile. I did not type out a lengthy emotional response. I did not demand any pathetic apologies or offer any lengthy explanations regarding the corporate liquidation of the Bellevue estate. Explanations were for equals, and we were absolutely no longer equals. I opened my digital photo gallery and selected the high-resolution image I had taken just a few days prior. It was a perfectly focused, crystal-clear photograph of the crumpled, partially shredded power of attorney receipt from the fraudulent notary public. I stared at the digital image for a brief moment, ensuring the treacherous details were perfectly legible. I attached the damning image to the empty text message thread. Below the photograph, I typed a single perfectly punctuated sentence that would officially seal their absolute doom forever and permanently ruin their pathetic lives completely. Have a nice trip. I pressed send, placed the phone face down on the polished glass table, leaned back heavily into the extremely comfortable leather armchair, and silently watched the bright city lights shine beautifully through the violently pouring rain. The next morning arrived with a pale, washed-out light filtering through the dense gray clouds gathering over the city skyline. I did not linger in the luxurious comfort of my premium hotel suite. The time for passive observation and silent preparation had officially ended entirely. I meticulously dressed in my sharpest custom-tailored charcoal suit, gripping the thick leather briefcase containing every piece of highly damning evidence Thomas Mitchell and I had painstakingly compiled over the previous 24 hours. I drove directly into the absolute heart of the busy financial district, pulling smoothly into the subterranean parking garage of the main federal building. The massive, imposing concrete structure represented the absolute apex of pure legal authority, a cold place where petty domestic disputes were entirely ignored and severe financial crimes were prosecuted with absolute unapologetic prejudice. I bypassed the standard public security checkpoints completely, carrying a specialized visitor pass Thomas had personally secured for me earlier that morning. I walked purposefully into the brightly illuminated central lobby and took the private elevator straight up to the regional headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My leather shoes echoed softly against the polished terrazzo floors as I steadily approached the heavy glass doors of the elite white-collar crime division. I was immediately escorted into a stark, completely windowless, heavily soundproofed conference room. A tall, composed man with sharp, analytical eyes walked into the room. He introduced himself as Special Agent David Miller, a senior investigator specializing exclusively in massive corporate fraud and international financial crimes. He did not offer empty platitudes or waste precious time with casual conversation. He sat down across the cold metal table, opened a blank legal pad, and looked at me with an expression of pure, objective calculation. I unlatched my leather briefcase and began systematically laying out the physical proof of my son's absolute treachery. I handed him the highly detailed digital IP logs tracking the fraudulent home equity line of credit. I presented the official banking documents clearly displaying the meticulously forged signature they had secretly practiced while I rested completely unaware. I slid the crumpled purple ink receipt from the corrupt, compromised notary public smoothly across the table. Finally, I presented the absolute crowning piece of their sinister criminal conspiracy. I handed Agent Miller the fraudulent medical guardianship petition, complete with the fabricated psychological evaluation, falsely diagnosing me with rapidly advancing late-stage dementia. I watched the federal agent carefully scrutinize the thick stack of documents, his sharp eyes darting rapidly across the printed pages, silently absorbing the sheer, heavily coordinated magnitude of the stunning domestic deception unfolding before him. As Agent Miller methodically categorized the verified evidence into clearly labeled file folders, a profound, deeply agonizing wave of sheer parental sorrow suddenly washed over me. I watched his pen glide across the yellow paper, and my weary mind drifted back through the long decades. I thought deeply about the grueling, physically destroying 70-hour work weeks I had consistently endured during the peak of my demanding logistics career. I painfully remembered missing countless family dinners, completely missing important birthdays, and completely sacrificing quiet weekend mornings, all to ensure that my family never experienced the brutal, terrifying sting of absolute financial insecurity that had heavily plagued my own difficult childhood. I had built an absolute impenetrable fortress of wealth and comfortable privilege around Bradley, fiercely shielding him from every conceivable hardship. I had foolishly, blindly believed that providing unlimited financial resources was the absolute highest, most profound expression of paternal love. I eagerly paid for his premium education, fully funded his incredibly luxurious lifestyle, and constantly caught him whenever he carelessly stumbled. I never forced him to face the harsh, completely unforgiving consequences of his own foolish, reckless decisions. Sitting quietly in that cold, sterile federal conference room, the bitter, utterly sickening truth finally crystallized in my mind with terrifying clarity. By giving my son absolutely everything he ever desired, without ever requiring a single ounce of genuine, sustained effort, I had effectively insulated him from developing any basic human empathy. I had inadvertently, tragically engineered his overwhelming sense of absolute toxic entitlement. I had meticulously paved the remarkably smooth, completely effortless road that directly led him to view me not as a loving, devoted father, but merely as a heavily funded, highly inconvenient biological obstacle, permanently standing between him and his massive, entirely unearned inheritance. In my desperate, incredibly blind attempt to aggressively protect him from the harsh, demanding realities of the everyday world, I had successfully created a completely hollow, intensely greedy monster who valued absolutely nothing but his own selfish gratification. Agent Miller loudly cleared his throat abruptly, pulling me back from the dark, incredibly painful abyss of my haunting memories. He firmly stacked the damning documents together, tapping the edges neatly and aggressively against the cold metal table. He looked directly at me, his professional demeanor entirely stripped of any polite neutrality, replaced entirely by a cold, deeply predatory focus. He explicitly stated that this incredibly massive deception was absolutely no longer a simple civil dispute over a stolen residential property or a highly contested medical guardianship petition. He carefully explained that by deliberately executing the massive $800,000 wire transfer explicitly across international borders to the Cayman Islands, Bradley and Monica had officially irrevocably elevated their pathetic domestic scheme into a highly severe multi-million-dollar federal offense. Agent Miller systematically listed the incredibly heavy impending charges. They were currently facing multiple distinct counts of highly aggravated wire fraud, severe international bank fraud, felony document forgery, and a massive criminal conspiracy to explicitly defraud a highly vulnerable senior adult. The completely fraudulent medical evaluation alone constituted a massive, heavily punishable violation of strict federal medical privacy laws. He stated with absolute, terrifying clarity that the federal government absolutely does not offer any leniency for arrogant criminals who deliberately attempt to systematically strip the elderly of their fundamental human rights and heavily protected physical assets. The sheer crushing weight of the impending federal hammer was almost physically palpable in the sterile, heavily conditioned air of the quiet conference room. I took a slow breath and calmly asked him what the immediate tactical next steps in this aggressively expanding legal operation would officially be. Agent Miller stood up slowly from the metal table, carefully gathering the neatly categorized file folders containing the absolute, undeniable destruction of my son's entire life into his arms. He offered me a grim, highly confident smile. He told me he was walking down the secure hall to present this absolutely flawless mountain of hard evidence directly to the presiding federal magistrate. He assured me the formal arrest warrants would be officially signed and entered into the National Federal Database before the sun set this evening. The luxury cruise ship was scheduled to finally conclude its heavily disrupted voyage in exactly 10 days. Agent Miller buttoned his suit jacket and looked me dead in the eye. He promised me that when that massive ship finally docked, Bradley and Monica would not simply walk away into the warm sunshine. Warrants are quietly issued. They will be waiting at the arrival gate in Miami. I walked out of the federal building and stepped into the pale afternoon light, feeling the absolute certainty of justice settling into my bones. The warrants were secured, but a federal indictment alone was not enough to satisfy the profound depth of my anger. Monica had attempted to steal my home to fund her reckless offshore gambling, and I needed to ensure that her precious digital empire completely collapsed before she even realized she was under investigation. I sat in my car and dialed the direct cellular number of a former colleague who now sat on the executive board of the Federal Banking Commission. I did not ask for a personal favor. I invoked the strict regulatory protocols designed specifically to protect vulnerable assets. I detailed the $800,000 home equity line of credit, providing the exact routing numbers for the Cayman Islands wire transfer. I formally declared the entire transaction as a highly sophisticated, meticulously documented case of severe elder financial abuse. The response was immediate and utterly devastating. Within 2 hours, my contact had engaged the international banking SWIFT system. They issued a Level 1 federal freeze on the dispersed funds, locking the capital in a state of permanent bureaucratic purgatory. The massive sum of money was violently ripped out of Monica's offshore crypto exchange account and placed into a heavily guarded federal holding trust, pending the ongoing criminal investigation. Her highly anticipated financial windfall was completely neutralized. The profound impact of that specific financial maneuver was almost instantaneous. Monica had undoubtedly structured her offshore crypto investments on aggressive margins, fully expecting my $800,000 to safely cover her wildly leveraged positions. By legally severing the critical supply of incoming capital, I had effectively pulled the structural linchpin completely out of her digital house of cards. Her heavily leveraged portfolio would automatically trigger catastrophic margin calls, entirely liquidating whatever legitimate assets she still possessed to cover the massive shortfall. She was not simply losing the money she had stolen from my estate. She was actively bleeding out every single penny of her own deeply hidden wealth. She was bankrupting herself while floating aimlessly on a luxury cruise ship in the Mediterranean Sea. The sheer poetic justice of her self-inflicted financial ruin was a remarkably soothing balm to my wounded paternal pride. I drove back to my premium hotel suite and poured a single glass of sparkling water, preferring complete mental clarity over the dulling effects of alcohol. I needed to remain perfectly sharp for the inevitable retaliatory strike. Criminals who are suddenly deprived of their stolen oxygen do not simply accept their grim fate with quiet dignity. They thrash wildly. They lash out blindly in pure desperation. And exactly 2 days later, the desperate thrashing finally commenced. My secure mobile phone began to vibrate violently on the glass coffee table, displaying an unknown local number. I immediately activated the digital call recording software I had explicitly installed for this exact scenario and calmly answered the incoming call. The voice on the other end was aggressively loud, completely frantic, and dripping with unhinged malice. It was Monica's younger brother, the heavily indebted gambling addict who had so arrogantly posed as the official notary public. His voice trembled with raw, uncontrolled fury as he demanded to know exactly why the massive real estate funds had been aggressively frozen. He shrieked that his sister was going to lose her entire international portfolio, completely oblivious to the fact that he was actively confessing to severe financial conspiracy over a recorded cellular line. I remained perfectly silent, allowing him to dig his own miserable grave deeper with every single panicked syllable. When he realized I was completely ignoring his demands, his sheer panic rapidly morphed into terrifying aggression. He explicitly threatened to come find me at the Bellevue estate, violently promising to physically force me to authorize the immediate release of the frozen capital. He detailed exactly how he planned to violently harm a defenseless old man to protect his sister's stolen digital empire. I listened to his pathetic, incredibly desperate threats with absolute chilling detachment. I gently informed him that the Bellevue estate was currently occupied by a heavily armed private security team and wished him the absolute best of luck with his impending visit. I smoothly ended the call and immediately forwarded the pristine audio recording directly to Special Agent Miller at the Federal Bureau. Monica's brother had just wonderfully upgraded his impending forgery charges by officially adding felony extortion and severe terroristic threats to his rapidly expanding federal indictment. The subsequent sunny days passed with a slow, deeply satisfying, and incredibly peaceful rhythm. I finally had the quiet space to fully reflect on everything that had completely happened. I spent my time exploring the sprawling city, reading complex literature, and breathing the clean, entirely unburdened air of a man who had finally successfully excised a massive life-threatening tumor from his personal existence. By the exact time day 10 of the lengthy 14-day cruise finally arrived, the absolute reality of their horrific situation had fully materialized. They were officially trapped in a terrifying, completely inescapable nightmare of their own meticulous creation. The heavily automated systems of the massive cruise ship are entirely unforgiving. With their primary VIP credit card formally canceled and their remaining secondary financial accounts bouncing violently against hard federal freezes, their access to basic luxury amenities was completely terminated. They were physically locked out of premium dining rooms, aggressively denied access to essential internet packages, and publicly humiliated by the ship's financial concierge staff on a daily basis. The beautiful, opulent vacation they had so eagerly anticipated had officially become a floating, highly visible prison of sheer humiliation. The grand, towering illusion of their immense wealth had totally and completely shattered right in front of the very people they had so desperately tried to impress. As the evening sun dipped below the distant Seattle skyline, my phone rang again. This time, the caller identification displayed an international number originating directly from the port city of Naples, Italy. I accepted the call and held the device to my ear. Bradley's voice came through the static, sounding entirely broken, completely devoid of any remaining arrogance. He was openly weeping. He choked out a pathetic, desperately trembling plea for mercy. He revealed that Pamela and Richard, entirely disgusted by the endless public humiliations and the sudden catastrophic lack of premium funding, had completely abandoned them in the foreign port. Monica's parents had hastily booked their own private flights back to the United States, using their own personal funds, deliberately leaving their daughter and son-in-law stranded on the docks with absolutely nothing. Bradley audibly sobbed into the receiver, his voice cracking pitifully as he begged his father for basic salvation. He wildly pleaded for me to wire him just enough money to secure a cheap economy-class flight back home. He blindly swore he would do anything to repair the massive, irreversible damage. I listened to the pathetic, cold, and entirely hollow sound of his absolute surrender, feeling the final heavy lock of my perfectly orchestrated trap clicking firmly into its permanent place. The line remained open, filled only with the ragged sound of my son desperately gasping for air. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I did not offer a shred of paternal sympathy. I told Bradley, my voice completely devoid of any emotion, that financial mismanagement carries severe personal consequences. I explicitly stated that my capital was no longer available to subsidize their catastrophic failures. I informed him that he was a fully grown man who had eagerly claimed the legal right to manage my entire estate, and therefore he was entirely capable of managing his own international travel logistics. I calmly advised him to liquidate whatever physical assets they had brought with them, and immediately disconnected the call, permanently blocking his number from my device. The next 48 hours for them must have been an absolute descent into sheer, unmitigated madness. Through the highly efficient tracking capabilities of my private investigator, I received regular detailed updates regarding their frantic scramble for survival in a foreign city. Monica was forcefully compelled to march into a modest Italian pawnshop, carrying the heavy velvet pouches containing her extensive collection of designer jewelry. Pieces I had generously purchased for her over the past decade were unceremoniously traded for pennies on the dollar to a local merchant who recognized pure desperation. When the liquidated jewelry failed to cover the exorbitant cost of last-minute international airfare, they were reduced to begging. Bradley spent hours desperately calling his affluent country club friends back in Seattle, pleading for temporary loans, fabricating elaborate lies about stolen wallets and compromised bank accounts. One by one, their wealthy associates, sensing the deeply toxic nature of the sudden financial crisis, politely declined. Eventually, they managed to scrape together just enough capital from a distant sympathetic relative to purchase 3 heavily restricted, incredibly uncomfortable economy-class tickets on a heavily delayed commercial carrier. The incredibly long journey back home to Seattle took them nearly 2 full days of miserable, exhausting travel. They were forced to endure incredibly long layovers in completely crowded, noisy terminals, sleeping on hard plastic chairs, completely stripped of the lavish, pampered existence they had arrogantly assumed was their permanent birthright. While they suffered the grueling consequences of their own absolute treachery, I spent my own time completing the final, completely devastating phase of my retaliatory operation. On the crisp, slightly overcast afternoon of their scheduled arrival, I drove my rental vehicle to the Bellevue neighborhood. I parked a block away, sitting quietly in the driver's seat, observing the magnificent transformation of my former home. The sprawling property was completely unrecognizable. The lush, vibrant warmth of our family sanctuary had been entirely eradicated. In its place stood a cold, aggressively sterilized corporate asset. Massive, bright yellow and black signs bearing the aggressive logo of Apex Property Solutions were firmly staked into the manicured front lawn, boldly declaring the estate as a highly distressed property available for immediate unconditional liquidation. The beautiful silk drapes that once framed the massive bay windows were completely gone, leaving the glass panes looking dark, hollow, and incredibly empty. Through the sheer, unobstructed glass, I could clearly see that the interior of the house had been thoroughly and aggressively gutted. The custom light fixtures, the imported flooring, and the expensive architectural details had all been ruthlessly stripped away, leaving nothing but bare walls and exposed subflooring. The firm had moved with terrifying speed, rapidly preparing the highly valuable shell for a fast, immensely profitable corporate flip. But the most striking addition to the property was the heavy security presence. 2 large, incredibly imposing private security guards, wearing dark tactical gear, stood shoulder to shoulder, directly in front of the primary wrought iron gates. They looked like statues, their expressions completely unreadable behind dark sunglasses, their hands resting securely near the heavy-duty utility belts strapped to their waists. They were strictly instructed to deny entry to anyone not explicitly authorized by the Apex corporate office. I stepped out of my vehicle and walked slowly down the sidewalk, stopping just a few dozen yards away from the imposing front gates. I folded my hands calmly in front of me, breathing in the cool, damp Pacific Northwest air. I felt absolutely no sadness looking at the hollow shell of my former life. A house is merely wood, stone, and glass. The true value of a home lies entirely in the love, loyalty, and mutual respect shared by the people living inside it. Bradley and Monica had entirely destroyed that foundation long before the demolition crews arrived. They had polluted the space with their incredibly toxic greed, reducing a monument of decades of hard work into a staging ground for a vicious, highly illegal corporate coup. I was merely finalizing the demolition they had so eagerly started. I stood there for nearly an hour, feeling the slight chill of the afternoon breeze, waiting patiently for the absolute climax of my meticulously engineered revenge. Finally, the distinct sound of a struggling combustion engine echoed softly down the wide, affluent street. A battered, heavily dented, bright yellow taxicab slowly rounded the corner, completely looking out of place among the pristine luxury vehicles parked in the surrounding driveways. The cab sputtered loudly as it clumsily pulled directly into the wide driveway of the Bellevue estate, violently braking just a few feet away from the heavy iron gates. The brake pads squealed in high-pitched protest as the vehicle lurched to a complete stop. The rear passenger door opened slowly with a heavy metallic groan. Bradley stepped out first. He looked completely devastated, wearing the exact same wrinkled, heavily stained clothes he had been wearing since they left Italy. His face was pale, entirely shadowed by days of profound stress and severe sleep deprivation. He slowly reached back into the cab and pulled out a single cheap canvas duffel bag, the only piece of luggage they had managed to retain after liquidating everything else to survive. Monica emerged from the opposite side of the vehicle. She looked entirely unrecognizable, completely stripped of her usual, heavily manicured, highly arrogant glamour. Her hair was a tangled, completely messy knot, and her designer travel outfit was thoroughly rumpled and deeply soiled. She aggressively slammed the cab door shut, her movements frantic and incredibly uncoordinated. Finally, little Leo slid out of the back seat. He looked tired, rubbing his small eyes, holding tightly onto the hand of his mother. He stared up at the massive house with a deeply confused, incredibly innocent expression. Bradley and Monica slowly turned to face their glorious, heavily anticipated home, fully expecting to walk through the front doors and instantly reclaim their stolen kingdom. Instead, they were violently confronted by the harsh, completely uncompromising reality of their absolute destruction. They simultaneously froze in their tracks, staring blankly at the massive bright yellow sale signs dominating the barren lawn. They looked at the hollow dark windows. They looked at the two massive, heavily armed security guards blocking their path. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of the absolute disaster completely crushed them, leaving them standing helplessly in the driveway of a house that no longer belonged to them. Bradley was the very first to snap out of the paralyzing shock. He dropped his cheap canvas travel bag onto the concrete and marched aggressively toward the tall, wrought iron gates. He loudly demanded that the security guards immediately step aside, claiming he was the rightful owner of the massive estate, and violently threatening to call the local police if they did not instantly comply with his strict orders. The two massive guards did not flinch whatsoever. They remained perfectly still, their dark sunglasses hiding any trace of emotion, their large hands resting securely on their heavy utility belts. Bradley took another angry step forward, foolishly, attempting to physically push his way past the imposing man standing on the left. It was a pathetic, wildly misguided maneuver. The tall guard simply raised a heavy black-gloved hand and shoved Bradley backward with an effortless, incredibly punishing force. Bradley stumbled violently across the wide driveway, his expensive but filthy travel shoes scraping loudly against the rough pavement, before he lost his balance entirely and fell incredibly hard onto his hands and trembling knees. Monica suddenly erupted. The humiliating sight of her arrogant husband being physically repelled from her supposed kingdom completely shattered the last remaining fragments of her rapidly deteriorating sanity. She aggressively lunged forward, her exhausted face twisting instantly into a horrific mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She began screaming at the absolute top of her lungs, her shrill, piercing voice echoing violently down the quiet suburban street. She desperately demanded to be let into her beautiful house immediately. She hysterically threatened to aggressively sue the private security company, the ruthless real estate firm, and the entire city government for this outrageous trespass. The heavily armed guards remained utterly unmoved, completely ignoring her increasingly hysterical demands. Little Leo stood quietly by the idling taxi, silently watching his parents completely unravel his small, innocent face turning pale with absolute confusion and mounting fear. I watched this incredibly pathetic, highly illuminating display from my secure vantage point, located just down the street, feeling a cold, deeply satisfying sense of absolute unwavering control. I slowly began walking directly toward the blocked driveway, my steady footsteps completely silent against the hard pavement. The security guards, recognizing my face immediately from the highly detailed access roster provided by the massive corporate liquidation firm, stepped slightly aside without uttering a single word, allowing me to easily pass through their otherwise impenetrable physical line. I stepped confidently out from the long, dark shadows cast by the towering brick entrance pillars and stood entirely exposed, looking directly down at my utterly ruined, completely defeated son and his highly hysterical, utterly unhinged wife. Monica abruptly stopped her hysterical screaming entirely mid-sentence, freezing in pure disbelief. Her jaw hung wide open in absolute unadulterated shock, her wide, bloodshot eyes locking instantly onto my perfectly calm face. Bradley violently scrambled clumsily and desperately to his feet, quickly dusting his painfully scraped palms on his terribly filthy, completely wrinkled suit trousers. He instantly stared directly at me with a truly sickening, highly complex mixture of deep terror and lingering, entirely delusional entitlement. The heavy silence that instantly fell over the wide concrete driveway was profoundly thick, broken only by the distant, steady hum of suburban traffic and the incredibly ragged, extremely shallow breathing of my deeply cornered, completely doomed enemies. Monica was the first to successfully find her missing voice. Her initial paralyzing shock rapidly morphed straight back into a highly toxic, deeply aggressive venom. She pointed a violently trembling, perfectly manicured finger directly at the center of my chest. She loudly called me a completely crazy, utterly demented, entirely helpless old man. She viciously screamed that I had finally lost my failing mind, entirely claiming that my severe cognitive decline had somehow caused me to hallucinate some ridiculous betrayal, and asserting that I had illegally sold their permanent home out of pure, unadulterated senile spite. I absolutely did not raise my voice whatsoever. I deliberately did not match her highly hysterical, incredibly frantic energy. I slowly and smoothly reached inside the hidden inner pocket of my custom-tailored dark charcoal jacket. My steady fingers smoothly grasped the incredibly thick, carefully folded document I had specifically brought to deliver for this exact highly anticipated moment. I pulled it out slowly and held it up perfectly steady in the pale, fading afternoon light. It was the complete, highly detailed medical guardianship petition, fully equipped with the utterly fraudulent psychological evaluation and the incredibly poorly forged signatures. I looked directly and piercingly into Monica's terrified, wildly darting eyes and calmly tossed the thick stack of criminal papers directly at her dirty feet. The heavy pages fluttered slightly in the cooling breeze before landing loudly against the solid concrete driveway. I took a single, highly deliberate step forward, allowing my voice to intentionally drop into a deeply dangerous, completely icy whisper that automatically commanded absolute, terrifying silence. "Is this exactly why I am completely crazy, Monica?" I calmly asked, letting the incredibly sharp words hang heavily in the surrounding air. "Is it simply because you deliberately diagnosed me with severe, rapidly advancing dementia, just to successfully steal my beautiful home?" I silently watched the remaining color completely and permanently drain away from her pale face. Her exhausted eyes darted frantically down toward the absolute, undeniable physical proof of her massive, deeply illegal criminal conspiracy, resting quietly by her soiled shoes, and then rapidly back up to my completely unforgiving, utterly relentless expression. The absolute, highly terrifying realization that I fully possessed the complete, unredacted, deeply documented truth finally crashed down heavily upon her fragile mind. She took a slow, terribly trembling step backward, her mouth opening and closing repeatedly without ever producing a single sound. Bradley, suddenly realizing that their highly aggressive, deeply offensive tactics had entirely failed them. Instantly pivoted to a completely different, highly pathetic strategy. He desperately abandoned his totally false authority and immediately adopted the weak, deeply manipulative role of an entirely helpless victim. He quickly stepped directly in front of his fully paralyzed wife, fake tears rapidly welling up in his completely desperate eyes. He gestured wildly and pathetically toward little Leo, who was still standing incredibly quietly by the idling, bright yellow taxicab. He began to loudly cry, his voice purposefully cracking with deep theatrical emotion. He accused me of being a totally heartless, incredibly cruel monster. He demanded to know how I could possibly do this to my own flesh and blood. He loudly sobbed that I was deliberately leaving his entirely innocent son completely homeless on the streets. He pleaded with me to look at my grandson and explain why his grandfather had ruthlessly destroyed his family. I looked directly at Bradley with profound, absolute disgust. Before I could speak a single word, the quiet suburban street was abruptly filled with the heavy sound of large combustion engines. Two massive, entirely blacked-out corporate SUVs turned the corner sharply. They accelerated rapidly down the street, their dark windows reflecting the sky. The vehicles pulled up forcefully to the curb, parking with aggressive precision directly behind the taxicab, effectively blocking the vehicle from leaving. The heavy reinforced doors of the massive black vehicles swung open simultaneously, with a sharp, synchronized mechanical thud that echoed ominously across the wide suburban street. Four tall, incredibly imposing figures stepped out onto the damp pavement, their perfectly tailored dark suits and severe, unsmiling expressions radiating an aura of absolute terrifying authority. Leading the highly disciplined group was Special Agent David Miller, the senior federal investigator, who had personally reviewed the overwhelming mountain of undeniable, highly damning evidence just a few short days prior. He smoothly adjusted his suit jacket, his sharp, analytical eyes locking instantly onto my deeply cornered, entirely paralyzed son and his utterly unhinged wife. The sheer physical presence of the federal agents instantly transformed the atmosphere of the quiet neighborhood into a highly volatile, actively hostile crime scene. The two private security guards blocking the driveway completely recognized the supreme federal authority, immediately stepping back slightly to grant the advancing agents complete unobstructed access to their prime targets. Monica, suddenly registering the incredibly severe, highly official nature of the rapidly escalating situation, violently snapped out of her hysterical, completely irrational rage. Her survival instinct, honed entirely by years of deep manipulative deception, instantly overwhelmed her crumbling sanity. She dropped her cheap travel bag directly onto the hard concrete and wildly lunged toward the narrow, unblocked gap between the idling taxicab and the manicured, perfectly trimmed hedges lining the sidewalk edge. She intended to flee, to blindly run away from the absolute crushing consequences of her massive, incredibly reckless criminal conspiracy. It was a completely pathetic, highly desperate, and utterly futile physical maneuver. Before she could even take 3 incredibly frantic steps, 2 heavily built federal agents moved with terrifying, entirely effortless speed. They smoothly intercepted her highly erratic flight path, completely blocking her escape route with their broad, solid shoulders. Monica violently slammed directly into their unyielding physical barrier, bouncing back and stumbling clumsily onto the wet pavement. She scrambled desperately backward like a deeply terrified, cornered animal, her chest heaving violently as the sheer, incredibly heavy realization of her absolute physical entrapment finally crashed down entirely upon her highly fragile, completely shattered mind. While Monica desperately thrashed against her total physical containment, Bradley simply stood entirely frozen in the center of the driveway. He did not attempt to run. He did not attempt to loudly argue or aggressively demand answers. His physical body remained entirely rigid, completely paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming magnitude of his absolute failure unfolding before him. He merely stared completely blankly at the advancing federal agents, his incredibly hollow, deeply exhausted eyes completely devoid of any remaining fight. The massive, towering illusion of his own superior intelligence and absolute unearned privilege completely evaporated in a single utterly devastating instant. He finally realized with profound, deeply agonizing clarity that he was no longer the highly protected, incredibly pampered son of a wealthy corporate architect. He was officially a completely exposed, utterly defenseless criminal, standing completely helpless before the absolute, incredibly unforgiving power of the United States federal government. The crushing, entirely suffocating weight of his impending, incredibly lengthy incarceration physically forced his shoulders to slump violently forward, making him look incredibly small, remarkably pathetic, and totally defeated. Special Agent Miller confidently approached the completely paralyzed couple, holding a thick, perfectly organized leather folder tightly in his right hand. He did not raise his voice, but his tone was incredibly sharp, deeply authoritative, and completely devoid of any basic human sympathy. He formally identified himself and his highly disciplined team, explicitly stating that they were officially executing multiple heavily coordinated federal arrest warrants. He looked directly into Bradley's terrified, wildly darting eyes and began to systematically list the incredibly severe, entirely inescapable criminal charges. He formally informed them that they were officially being taken into immediate federal custody for highly aggravated wire fraud, severe international bank fraud, and massive highly documented identity theft. He explicitly detailed their highly illegal, deeply treacherous conspiracy to deliberately commit severe elder financial abuse, referencing the completely fraudulent medical guardianship petition and the severely forged home equity line of credit documents. He stated with absolute terrifying clarity that the $800,000 wire transfer to the Cayman Islands had triggered a massive, highly aggressive international financial investigation that would effectively guarantee them both incredibly lengthy, completely inescapable sentences in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The moment the incredibly severe, highly terrifying words regarding maximum security federal prison sentences officially left Agent Miller's mouth, the incredibly toxic, completely hollow foundation of their treacherous marriage entirely shattered. Monica, still incredibly frantic and deeply cornered, instantly recognized that her only remaining path to even the slightest, most pathetic shred of legal leniency was absolute, total betrayal. She completely abandoned the man she had conspired with for years. She wildly pointed a violently shaking finger directly at Bradley's pale, deeply sweating face and began aggressively screaming at the advancing federal agents. She hysterically, desperately shrieked that the entire deeply illegal financial operation was completely his incredibly malicious idea. She loudly sobbed that she was merely an incredibly innocent, deeply manipulated victim who had been violently forced to participate in his incredibly wicked, highly illegal scheme to aggressively steal his father's vast, highly accumulated fortune. She shrieked that Bradley alone had personally forged the heavily documented banking signatures and that he had deliberately, completely maliciously bribed the corrupt notary public to illegally secure the massive, highly fraudulent loan against the Bellevue estate. Bradley stared at his deeply panicked, entirely treacherous wife with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. The woman he had completely sacrificed his own family to vehemently protect was now actively, incredibly violently attempting to forcefully shove him entirely under the massive, crushing wheels of the federal justice system. He opened his mouth to angrily defend himself, to completely expose her intense, deeply aggressive role in the massive criminal conspiracy, but absolutely no words successfully materialized. He finally understood that he had eagerly traded his own loyal father for an incredibly ruthless parasite who would instantly sacrifice him to perfectly save herself. He simply stood there, utterly broken, completely destroyed from the inside out, totally betrayed by the incredibly greedy, highly toxic monster he had so eagerly allied himself with. It was the absolute ultimate, completely poetic betrayal, strictly among highly desperate, entirely ruthless thieves. Agent Miller completely ignored Monica's highly pathetic, incredibly hysterical, deeply treacherous performance entirely. He smoothly signaled to his disciplined federal team Two sharply dressed agents swiftly stepped forward physically, securing the wildly screaming, deeply frantic woman. They aggressively pulled Monica's arms firmly behind her, violently shaking back. The incredibly distinct, highly metallic, entirely heavy click of cold steel handcuffs, tightly snapping directly onto her thin wrists, echoed loudly across the quiet, completely stunned suburban driveway. As Monica loudly wailed in pure, absolute legal defeat, the rear door of the second heavily tinted federal vehicle slowly opened. The absolute, final, incredibly devastating consequence of their completely reckless, highly illegal behavior finally stepped out into the pale afternoon light. Two incredibly stern, deeply serious agents from Child Protective Services walked slowly toward the completely paralyzed, utterly destroyed couple. They were officially here for little Leo. The two representatives from Child Protective Services moved with a calm, practiced efficiency that stood in stark contrast to the aggressive, highly kinetic energy of the federal agents. They were a man and a woman, wearing incredibly plain, unassuming business casual clothing, their official identification badges hanging loosely on blue lanyards around their necks. As they slowly walked up the concrete driveway toward the idling yellow taxi, the absolute gravity of the situation finally managed to penetrate the thick, paralyzing fog of Bradley's deep psychological shock. His wide, incredibly hollow eyes darted from the heavy steel handcuffs, currently restraining his wildly sobbing wife, directly to the two gentle, soft-spoken social workers who were currently kneeling down to speak quietly with his terribly confused, completely terrified son. The sudden, violently overwhelming realization that he was about to lose absolutely everything, his stolen wealth, his physical freedom, and his only child, instantly shattered whatever pathetic remnants of dignity he still possessed. Bradley completely broke down. He let out a loud, incredibly guttural, deeply agonizing wail that tore through the crisp afternoon air. He violently wrenched his shoulders forward, desperately breaking away from the initial light grip of the federal agent standing directly beside him. He did not attempt to flee toward the open street. Instead, he blindly threw his heavy, completely exhausted body directly across the wet pavement, scrambling frantically on his hands and incredibly bruised knees until he was positioned directly at my feet. He violently threw his arms forward, desperately grabbing the fine woolen fabric of my custom-tailored charcoal overcoat. His knuckles turned completely white as he gripped the dark material with pure, unadulterated desperation. He buried his heavily weeping, terribly filthy face directly into the lower hem of my jacket, sobbing with a heavy, completely uncontrolled ferocity that violently shook his entire frame. The federal agents instantly rushed forward to aggressively subdue him, their heavy boots slapping loudly against the concrete, but I simply raised a single calm hand silently, instructing them to pause for just a fraction of a moment. I wanted to fully experience the absolute profound depth of his total surrender. Bradley violently tilted his head backward, looking up at me with an expression of pure, deeply pathetic agony. Heavy tears rapidly streamed down his pale, heavily unshaven cheeks, mixing freely with the dark dirt and thick grime he had accumulated during his deeply miserable, completely humiliating journey back from Europe. His chest heaved violently as he desperately choked on his own ragged breaths. "Dad, please!" he violently sobbed, his voice cracking into a high, entirely pathetic whine. "Please tell them it is all a massive misunderstanding. Tell them we made a terrible mistake. We will completely pay it back. Every single penny I will work for the rest of my miserable life to completely pay you back. Just call off the agents. Please, Dad. I am begging you, do not let them take Leo away from me. Please do not let them take my son." I stood perfectly still, looking directly down at the deeply broken, incredibly desperate man kneeling violently in the dirt at my expensive shoes. I did not feel a single fleeting surge of hot, uncontrolled rage. I did not feel the sudden, overwhelming desire to aggressively scream or violently curse at him for the months of deep psychological torture he had so eagerly inflicted upon me. The fiery, deeply burning anger that had fueled my incredibly meticulous, highly aggressive corporate retaliation over the past 14 days had entirely evaporated. In its place, I felt nothing but an absolute, profoundly chilling, completely unbreakable calm. It was the serene, entirely undisturbed tranquility of a man who had successfully excised a deeply toxic, incredibly malignant tumor from his life forever. I looked deeply into his wildly desperate, incredibly bloodshot eyes. I slowly reached down and firmly grasped his terribly trembling, heavily sweating hands. I did not pull him up to his feet. I simply aggressively peeled his violently clutching fingers completely off the fine fabric of my expensive overcoat, letting his heavy hands drop uselessly back down onto the cold, hard concrete. I maintained complete, unwavering eye contact as I delivered the final, incredibly devastating blow. My voice was entirely smooth, perfectly level, and completely devoid of any basic human warmth. I deliberately echoed the exact, deeply dismissive text message he had carelessly sent to me so many months ago when he first initiated his treacherous betrayal. "I cannot help you, Bradley," I stated quietly, the sharp, entirely unforgiving words cutting through his hysterical sobbing like a perfectly sharpened surgical blade. "Plans changed. I only want to be with my family, and you are absolutely no longer a part of it." The sheer, incredibly brutal finality of my perfectly calm statement completely drained the very last ounce of fighting spirit from his terribly broken body. The tiny, deeply pathetic spark of desperate hope that had been frantically flickering in his incredibly wide eyes instantly extinguished. He let out a soft, entirely defeated whimper and simply collapsed, completely forward, his forehead violently striking the cold pavement as he curled into a tight, incredibly pathetic fetal position. He did not violently resist or wildly protest when the two heavily armed federal agents swiftly stepped forward, grabbed him aggressively by his upper arms, and forcefully hauled his dead weight directly up from the hard driveway. They swiftly pulled his trembling hands behind his back, the heavy, incredibly distinct sound of the ratcheting steel handcuffs securely locking into place, signaling the absolute permanent end of his highly privileged, incredibly arrogant existence. I completely turned my back on him. I did not watch as the federal agents forcefully marched my heavily weeping son and his wildly screaming, entirely unhinged wife directly toward the massive, heavily tinted black corporate vehicles idling aggressively at the curb. Monica was violently thrashing against her heavy restraints, violently shrieking a constant, incredibly toxic stream of terrible obscenities and deeply vicious threats. Her shrill voice gradually muffling as she was aggressively shoved directly into the dark, incredibly secure back seat of the primary federal cruiser. I calmly adjusted the lapels of my tailored overcoat and walked with slow, highly measured, incredibly purposeful steps directly toward the two quiet social workers standing near the bright yellow taxicab. They were speaking in incredibly soft, deeply soothing tones to little Leo, who was quietly weeping, his small, incredibly fragile shoulders trembling slightly in the cool afternoon breeze. The male social worker slowly stood up as I confidently approached, respectfully shielding the deeply terrified child from the highly chaotic, incredibly aggressive arrest actively unfolding just a few yards away. I stopped directly in front of the dedicated state worker and reached into my thick leather briefcase. I smoothly pulled out a perfectly pristine manila envelope and handed it to him. Inside was a highly complete set of fully approved and legally binding emergency custody documents, precisely prepared by my brilliant attorney, Thomas Mitchell. The social worker carefully scanned the official judicial signatures, respectfully nodded, and politely stepped aside. I knelt down, took Leo's tiny, trembling hand, and gently led my family away from the absolute wreckage. I held his small, trembling hand firmly in mine as we walked away from the flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles. I deliberately kept my gaze moving forward, refusing to look back at the dark-tinted windows of the squad cars that now contained the complete physical ruins of my former family. Little Leo was incredibly quiet. He did not cry and he did not ask any complicated questions. He simply gripped my fingers with a terrifying, desperate strength, instinctively sensing that I was the absolute only source of true safety left in his violently shattered world. We walked slowly toward my waiting rental vehicle. I opened the heavy passenger door, gently helped him secure his seatbelt, and quietly drove away from the Bellevue neighborhood forever. The massive, beautiful estate that had completely hosted the absolute darkest, most intensely treacherous chapter of my long life rapidly disappeared in the rearview mirror. I felt absolutely no sadness as the towering brick pillars vanished from my sight. I felt only a profound, incredibly pure sense of total liberation. The next 6 months passed in a highly rigorous, incredibly demanding blur of absolute legal and emotional reconstruction. The massive federal trial moved forward with terrifying, entirely unapologetic speed. Agent Miller and his highly disciplined team had meticulously assembled an absolutely flawless, utterly impenetrable mountain of hard physical evidence. When the formal proceedings officially commenced in the heavily guarded federal courthouse, there was absolutely no room for any dramatic, highly theatrical courtroom maneuvers. The sheer volume of the damning digital logs, the fully verified forged signatures, and the incredibly incriminating recorded phone calls completely suffocated any pathetic attempt at a legitimate defense. Monica and Bradley did not face the heavy scales of justice as a united, fiercely loyal front. The very moment they realized the absolute severity of their impending incarceration, they instantly, violently turned on each other like starved wolves. Monica aggressively took the witness stand and spent 3 grueling days loudly weeping, furiously claiming that Bradley was a highly abusive, deeply controlling mastermind who had violently forced her to actively participate in the massive financial fraud against her fragile will. She painted an incredibly elaborate, deeply pathetic picture of herself as a completely terrified victim. Bradley immediately retaliated. He aggressively instructed his own defense attorney to completely expose Monica's severe, incredibly reckless, offshore gambling addiction. He provided extensive, highly documented records proving that she had personally orchestrated the entire fraudulent home equity line of credit specifically to fund her wildly leveraged cryptocurrency accounts. He loudly sobbed that he had only forged the medical guardianship documents because his wife had relentlessly manipulated his deep, incredibly misguided loyalty. Watching them violently tear each other apart in the quiet, highly sterile courtroom was a profoundly tragic, deeply illuminating spectacle. The federal judge presiding over the incredibly complex case was absolutely unswayed by their pathetic, highly desperate performances. The final sentencing was swift, entirely brutal, and completely absolute. Monica received a highly severe mandate of exactly 8 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The judge explicitly cited her incredibly malicious, deeply calculated attempt to forcefully strip a highly vulnerable senior citizen of his fundamental human rights. Bradley received a slightly lesser but equally devastating sentence of 5 full years in a federal facility heavily penalized for his deeply treacherous role in executing the massive wire fraud and forging the highly critical financial documents. They were both escorted directly out of the quiet courtroom in heavy steel chains, their pathetic, highly toxic alliance permanently and completely shattered. The deep financial wreckage they had left behind was slowly and methodically repaired. My highly capable corporate attorney, Thomas Mitchell, worked aggressively alongside the dedicated Federal Banking Commission to successfully retrieve the stolen capital. Because the massive international wire transfer had been legally frozen before it could successfully merge into the highly volatile offshore exchanges, the entire $800,000 was eventually recovered. The massive sum was smoothly returned to my secure accounts, completely neutralizing the fraudulent home equity line of credit. The heavy liquidation of the Bellevue estate proceeded flawlessly. Apex Property Solutions successfully flipped the completely gutted property, entirely severing my final physical connection to that deeply tainted space. I never drove past those towering iron gates ever again. I happily let the cold, incredibly harsh memories simply fade away into absolute nothingness. My entire focus, my absolute sole purpose in life was now fully directed toward the incredibly delicate, highly profound task of deeply healing my grandson. I officially secured full, entirely permanent legal custody of little Leo. I purchased a beautiful, incredibly comfortable home in a quiet, heavily wooded neighborhood entirely far away from the toxic, highly pretentious suburbs of his early childhood. I deliberately created a completely safe, incredibly stable environment where he could finally breathe without constantly absorbing the incredibly heavy, deeply poisonous anxiety of his parents. The incredibly deep psychological trauma of his early years required massive, highly dedicated professional intervention. I immediately enrolled Leo in intensive, heavily structured child therapy. We spent countless hours sitting quietly in brightly lit, highly comforting professional offices, gently helping him process the terrifying, incredibly chaotic memories of the federal arrest and the sudden, highly absolute disappearance of his mother and father. It was incredibly painful, deeply exhausting work. There were many long, incredibly dark nights when he would wake up screaming, deeply terrified that the heavy, angry voices were coming back. During those highly vulnerable moments, I simply held him incredibly tightly, gently rocking him back and forth, softly promising him that he was completely safe, absolutely loved, and entirely protected. I completely abandoned my previous highly destructive philosophy of providing endless, incredibly lavish material wealth. I absolutely refused to make the exact same deeply tragic mistakes I had so foolishly made with his father. I did not buy him incredibly expensive, highly unnecessary designer toys. I did not shield him from simple, highly character-building daily chores. Instead, I gave him my complete, entirely undivided presence. We spent long, incredibly peaceful afternoons, simply walking through the dense local parks, skipping small stones across the quiet, gently flowing streams. I taught him how to carefully plant a small, incredibly vibrant garden in our modest backyard, patiently showing him how consistent, deeply steady effort could eventually create something truly beautiful and fundamentally strong. I dedicated every single ounce of my remaining energy to actively breaking the incredibly toxic, deeply entitled cycle of extreme greed that had completely destroyed his parents. Slowly, over the deeply challenging but incredibly rewarding months, the bright, incredibly beautiful light finally began to slowly return to his incredibly innocent eyes. He learned how to laugh without looking over his small shoulder. He learned how to trust that my calm, entirely steady presence would absolutely never waver or suddenly disappear. He finally learned that true, deeply meaningful love was not measured by highly expensive gifts or incredibly lavish vacations, but by quiet, entirely reliable loyalty and profound, entirely unwavering respect. We quietly built a completely new, incredibly beautiful life, entirely from the heavy ashes of the past, focusing entirely on quiet honesty, absolute integrity, and deeply authentic connection. The transition from the Pacific Northwest to the vibrant shores of Miami was a highly deliberate, meticulously calculated decision. I wanted absolutely no physical connection to the incredibly toxic, deeply treacherous world that Bradley and Monica had so ruthlessly constructed. I purchased a sprawling, completely secure penthouse in an exclusive, heavily monitored residential tower directly overlooking the magnificent, endlessly rolling waves of the Atlantic Ocean. The massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows allowed the pure, warm tropical sunlight to flood every single corner of our peaceful, utterly safe sanctuary. The heavy, deeply suffocating anxiety that had once defined Leo's fragile existence was entirely eradicated, successfully, replaced by the gentle, highly rhythmic sound of the ocean tide and the absolute certainty of my permanent protection. He had grown remarkably over the past several years, transforming from a completely terrified, deeply fragile child into a remarkably bright, incredibly thoughtful young boy, with a genuinely infectious, unburdened laugh. On a particularly warm, clear Saturday afternoon, we sat together out on the massive, pristine wraparound balcony. A gentle, refreshing sea breeze softly rustled the collar of my light linen shirt as I carefully arranged the solid, heavily weighted wooden pieces across the beautifully polished marble chessboard. Leo sat quietly across from me, his bright, incredibly curious eyes studying the complex strategic layout of the board with profound, absolutely unbroken concentration. I was deliberately teaching him the ancient, highly disciplined game not merely as a simple childhood diversion, but as a deeply profound, incredibly necessary lesson in fundamental human strategy and absolute inescapable consequence. I patiently explained to him that every single move, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, permanently alters the entire landscape of the board. I instructed him, my voice smooth and encouraging, that a wise player never simply reacts to the immediate, highly emotional present, but constantly meticulously looks 5 steps ahead, carefully anticipating the absolute undeniable repercussions of their chosen path. He reached forward with a small, incredibly steady hand and thoughtfully advanced his vulnerable knight, effectively protecting his exposed king. I smiled with profound, genuine pride, quietly acknowledging his impressive, deeply developing foresight. We were completely insulated from the incredibly harsh world far below us, existing entirely within a perfectly constructed, absolutely unbreakable bubble of pure safety and profound, incredibly quiet mutual respect. Our deeply peaceful, focused afternoon was briefly interrupted by the quiet, highly respectful arrival of my private estate manager. He stepped silently onto the sunlit balcony, holding a small, organized stack of daily correspondence on a polished silver tray. He bowed his head slightly, respectfully, placed the tray on the small glass table resting beside my chair, and quietly retreated back into the cool, air-conditioned interior of the penthouse. I deliberately waited for Leo to carefully plan his next complex strategic maneuver before I casually reached over and picked up the modest stack of envelopes. Most were entirely standard, highly predictable corporate reports and standard financial statements. However, the very last piece of mail, resting at the bottom of the neat pile, immediately caught my completely undivided attention. It was a cheap, flimsy, heavily textured white envelope. The stark, deeply sterile blue ink, stamped aggressively across the top left corner, clearly designated it as officially processed, monitored inmate correspondence, originating directly from a maximum security federal correctional institution. I stared directly at the familiar, heavily hurried handwriting, scrawled frantically across the center of the cheap paper. It was addressed to me bypassing my guarded corporate attorneys, successfully forwarded through a highly obscure, deeply buried residential holding shell company. I did not feel a single incredibly fleeting surge of unexpected emotional warmth. I did not feel the sudden, deeply foolish urge to instantly forgive and magically forget the incredibly catastrophic, deeply malicious damage he had deliberately chosen to violently inflict upon my life. I simply felt a cold, incredibly detached, highly clinical curiosity. I carefully slid my silver letter opener under the thin flap and smoothly extracted the heavily folded, wrinkled, deeply lined yellow paper. The frantic letter was an absolute, completely predictable masterpiece of pure, deeply manipulative victimhood. Bradley had completely filled 3 entire pages with incredibly dense, highly erratic paragraphs, desperately begging for my immediate, completely unconditional forgiveness. He loudly proclaimed that his deeply agonizing years, spent locked away inside the highly brutal, entirely unforgiving federal prison system, had miraculously cured him of his profound, incredibly toxic greed. He viciously, entirely predictably blamed every single incredibly illegal, deeply treacherous action entirely on Monica, loudly sobbing through the blue ink that she had completely poisoned his highly impressionable mind and forcefully coerced him into the massive, deeply documented financial betrayal. He desperately pleaded for an immediate, highly emotional personal visit, wildly promising that he was now a completely transformed, incredibly righteous man who only wanted a single, deeply pathetic chance to successfully rebuild our utterly shattered relationship. He begged me to tell his son that he was incredibly sorry, demanding that I actively facilitate a highly inappropriate, deeply traumatic telephone call between a convicted, completely disgraced federal felon and the incredibly innocent child he had so eagerly, completely, ruthlessly abandoned for stolen wealth. I read every single incredibly frantic, deeply pathetic word with absolute, entirely unwavering silence. I did not sigh. I did not shake my head in sudden, entirely unearned sorrow. I simply observed the incredibly stark, completely undeniable reality that my biological son had absolutely not changed in the slightest. The desperate, incredibly transparent words completely confirmed that he remained an incredibly toxic, fundamentally broken manipulator who was entirely incapable of accepting true, incredibly deep personal responsibility for his absolutely monstrous, deeply calculated actions. He was merely seeking a highly convenient, incredibly rapid escape route from his thoroughly deserved, legally mandated physical and psychological suffering. I looked incredibly calmly over the top of the heavily wrinkled, incredibly flimsy yellow pages, directly at little Leo. The highly intelligent, incredibly gentle young boy was entirely absorbed in the deeply complex, highly fascinating strategy of the beautiful wooden chessboard, completely oblivious to the incredibly dark, deeply poisonous ghosts of the terrible past, desperately attempting to forcefully claw their way back into his incredibly bright, completely secure present. He gently smiled, incredibly proud of a completely brilliant, highly defensive move he had just successfully executed. I simply smiled back, my heart completely filled with an absolutely profound, entirely unshakable, deeply protective love. I slowly, incredibly deliberately folded the terribly frantic, highly manipulative letter exactly along its original, deeply creased lines. I smoothly stood up from my comfortable, incredibly plush chair and calmly walked directly over to the highly secure steel paper shredder stationed quietly by the massive glass doors. I turned the powerful device on, listening to the incredibly sharp, steady hum of the heavy internal steel blades. I held the cheap, incredibly flimsy envelope and the stained yellow pages directly over the narrow, unforgiving opening. Some deeply treacherous, incredibly compromised bridges, once intentionally burned to absolute, entirely unsalvageable ash, should absolutely never under any conceivable circumstances be rebuilt. I released my steady fingers. The heavy steel blades instantly engaged, aggressively pulling the deeply toxic, incredibly manipulative words permanently down into absolute, irrecoverable nothingness. The heavy, sharp mechanical hum of the steel shredder slowly died away, leaving the sprawling Miami penthouse completely silent once again. I stood perfectly still for several long, profound moments, staring quietly down at the small, clear plastic bin actively collecting the destroyed remnants of his desperate, pathetic apology. The flimsy yellow paper had been entirely reduced to thin, completely illegible strips of meaningless ash. The absolute physical destruction of his manipulative words brought a deeply satisfying sense of total closure to my weary soul. I slowly turned my back on the sleek machine and walked smoothly across the immaculate hardwood flooring, stepping confidently outside. The vast, endless expanse of the deep blue Atlantic Ocean stretched completely uninterrupted toward the distant, hazy horizon. The warm, gentle tropical breeze softly brushed against my face, carrying the clean, refreshing scent of salt water and absolute, unshakable freedom. I leaned my hands comfortably against the smooth, cool glass railing and watched the magnificent fiery orange sun slowly begin its majestic descent into the rolling, rhythmic waves. For the first time in many exhausting years, my mind was entirely clear. I stood incredibly tall, letting my deep gaze sweep across the beautiful kingdom I had successfully carved out for us to share fully forever. I allowed my quiet thoughts to slowly drift backward, deliberately reflecting upon the challenging journey that had completely brought me to this absolutely perfect, triumphant moment. I thought deeply about the naive, fundamentally broken narrative that they had so arrogantly attempted to force upon me. They had looked directly at my graying hair, my quiet demeanor, and my deep, patient generosity, and they had violently, foolishly mistaken it for profound, irreversible weakness. They had arrogantly labeled me a clueless, senile old man who was actively waiting to simply fade away into complete, absolute obscurity within the walls of my very own quiet, safe family home. They genuinely believed that they could violently strip me of my dignity, successfully steal the massive corporate empire I had spent decades meticulously building, and easily discard me like an entirely useless, broken piece of old furniture. They were incredibly, utterly wrong. The absolute devastating magnitude of their monumental miscalculation had ultimately become their permanent undoing. I quietly observed the powerful, steady rhythm of the ocean tide directly below, feeling a profound connection to its unyielding, relentless force. I had spent my entire adult life meticulously constructing a massive, highly successful financial fortress designed to provide unyielding, endless security and absolute comfort for everyone forever. I had actively endured countless sleepless nights, brutal corporate negotiations, and massive market fluctuations specifically to ensure that my biological family would absolutely never experience any true financial insecurity. The profound, bitter irony was that the very wealth I had so tirelessly accumulated to successfully protect my son was the exact mechanism that ultimately exposed the deep toxic rot festering entirely within his fundamentally broken soul. But I had absolutely refused to be their passive, completely helpless victim. When they aggressively attempted to forcefully usurp my legitimate throne, I did not quietly surrender. I did not blindly panic or completely unravel into sheer emotional turmoil. Instead, I methodically, ruthlessly deployed the exact same sharp, analytical corporate instincts that had successfully built my vast fortune in the very first place. I moved silently within the dark, unseen shadows. I anticipated their reckless emotional maneuvers with absolute deadly precision. I allowed them to arrogantly believe they had completely won. I let them blindly celebrate their fraudulent, illegal victory right up until the exact perfect moment when I violently pulled the floor completely out from beneath their filthy, treacherous feet. I was absolutely no longer the clueless, highly vulnerable old man they had so viciously mocked during those very incredibly dark past days. I was the incredibly vigilant, utterly unyielding king who had successfully, completely, ruthlessly protected his magnificent crown from greedy, toxic usurpers. I had completely purged my beautiful kingdom of their incredibly poisonous, destructive presence, successfully banishing them to the absolute, incredibly bleak darkness of the federal penitentiary system. I slowly turned my head, my completely calm gaze landing softly upon little Leo. The exceptionally intelligent young boy was still seated quietly at the beautifully polished, solid marble chessboard. He was completely absorbed in the deeply complex, fascinating, strategic patterns lying directly before him, playing beautifully and learning rapidly every single day without any deep fear. He was absolutely thriving. The heavy, oppressive anxiety that had once constantly clouded his innocent, expressive eyes had entirely vanished. He was finally growing up in a completely clean, absolutely stable environment, entirely free from the toxic, highly manipulative legacy of his deeply disgraced parents. Looking directly at my incredibly peaceful, thoroughly engaged grandson, I finally understood the absolute profound truth of my entire existence. My true, authentic kingdom was absolutely not measured by the incredibly massive balance of my heavily guarded offshore corporate accounts, or by any vast, highly complex global stock portfolios, meticulously hidden deeply away from public scrutiny over the long years. Nor was it successfully defined by the highly impressive square footage of my sprawling luxury real estate portfolio. My true, undeniable wealth was the incredibly pure, completely unconditional love I could actively provide to this incredibly precious, highly vulnerable child. It was the profoundly satisfying knowledge that I possessed the incredibly rare, undeniable strength to completely burn away the heavily diseased, toxic branches of my own family tree, specifically to save the incredibly healthy, utterly beautiful roots. The incredibly vibrant, fiery colors of the spectacular Miami sunset actively painted the high evening sky in deeply brilliant shades of crimson and soft, truly glowing, pure gold. The profound silence of the sprawling penthouse was a beautiful, validating testament to my complete, absolutely undeniable victory. The brutal, exhausting war was officially completely over. I was perfectly safe, completely secure, and entirely free. I slowly walked away from the heavy glass railing and gently approached the beautifully polished table. I quietly pulled out my comfortable chair and sat down directly across from my focused grandson. Leo looked up from the heavily populated marble board, his completely innocent face breaking into a massive, incredibly warm smile. The long, deeply treacherous game had been completely, absolutely, and entirely decisively won by us here today, forever. Trust is the absolute foundation of any strong family, but blind trust remains a truly dangerous vulnerability. When you spend your entire life building vast wealth to protect your children, you actively risk blinding yourself to the terrible monsters they might eventually become. True love is not about giving them endless chances to ruthlessly exploit your immense generosity. It is about having the absolute courage to completely cut the cord when they confuse your deep kindness with weakness. You cannot ever heal a massive betrayal rooted in pure greed. Stand your ground, firmly. Protect your legacy, and never look backward. Have you ever faced a truly shocking betrayal from the people you trusted the most in life? Please share your personal story in the comments below. Do not forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more intense life stories, and tell me exactly where you are watching from today.